Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. I'm your host, Guru Nishan. And as always, I want to thank you for your listening support. If you want to be a guest on the podcast, please email me at gn@gurunishan.com. And please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. As always, I like to read the intentions for why I started this podcast. Number one, to break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community in the name of neutrality. Number two, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who have joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have practiced or taught Kundalini Yoga. Number three, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from this community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number four, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number five, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they are doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing to victims. Number six, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural appropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and the overall community ethos. Number seven, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number eight, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light washing mentality. Number nine, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through this community, both named and unnamed. And number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, process their own emotions, get somatic therapy and cult-specific therapy or other support as needed, to draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. I want to welcome today's guest to the podcast. His name is Shabad Singh, and he was born and raised in 3HO in the Herndon, Virginia ashram in 1987. His parents are Guru Trong Singh and Guru Matakar. He attended Midi Pidi Academy in India from 1999 to 2005 and was in the Eugene ashram from 2006 to 2012. And he taught at Midi Pidi Academy in India as an economics teacher in 2012 to 2014. It's been a slow but gradual disconnect from 3HO, and he fully disconnected in 2016. In 2017, he became politically active with Democratic Socialists of America and began to work in progressive politics, eventually working on the Bernie Sanders 2020 presidential campaign. He now lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Sukhmani Kar, and does work in climate advocacy for Al Gore's nonprofit organization, the Climate Reality Project. You can find him on Instagram at shabad.one and the platform formerly known as Twitter at Shabad Singh. I want to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I always like to ask my guests why you feel it's important to share your story.
I think it's important as a part of like a historical practice for folks to understand what I think, how people perceived of what they experienced. And, I think that's an important part of things. And I think that it's good to hear a lot of different perspectives on this issue in general, but our experiences in particular. because not everybody experiences them or evaluates them in quite the same way. And I think we can all draw useful conclusions from listening to each other's perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm particularly excited to have you on, Shabad, because I knew you before you went to India. And so I find the web of our relationship similar to what you just said, the way that we process, the way we navigate, we can be born and raised and have very different life experiences, yet common threads and webs of connectivity. So when I'm about 21-ish, I'm in the Herndon ashram and I actually lived with you and your family. So I want listeners to hear that. This is very exciting to me because it would be in your adult life that I realized, oh, I know him. Oh my God, I know him at Sing too. And I call it the web of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, we were so funny, I was trying to explain to somebody who you were, like it to me and how I knew you. And I was like, well, she moved into my house. Well, why did she move into your house? Well, we were in kind of connected to the same community cult kind of a thing. Okay. And how did she get, well, she'd just been living in Africa for a long time. And I believe she married a gentleman from Kenya. And then they came and lived with us. And I mean, it was just like, it's like, what a story, just even in that little thing. It's funny how a lot of times when people ask questions, I think this is an experience a lot of our peers, us and our peers kind of have experienced, is like when you're asked a simple question about your own history, it's like, there's a lot of backstory to explain even something kind of simple. I remember, just meeting people since I've gotten into politics and kind of worked in the mainstream professional world has been funny. It's like, you talk to people, well, where'd you grow up? What's your story? It's like, well, I grew up in this town and I played baseball and then I went to college and here I am. And it's not to say that if there's anything less in, I mean, heck, I would probably trade for a little bit of, mundanity, but yeah, it's funny just having those kinds of discussions with people. And it's impossible not to feel a little bit like it can be a little bit alienating, I think, for us or for me anyway. And you really don't want to make people feel like, oh, I have this interesting life or something like that. And it's funny. Like sometimes people, that's how they perceive it. And they go, oh, wow, that's so interesting. And I just grew up here and there. And it's like, I just want to be able to relate to people and connect to people. And
right.
Anyway, but yeah, it's just enough.
Totally. Absolutely. We're going to get into hearing your story, but I just wanted listeners to know at this stage, I must have been like 21-ish, and I got a job in Herndon by the recommendation of my brother who worked for Guru Jot Singh. And they needed somebody Guru Jot Singh wanted somebody who had experience in Africa. And so I got recommended because I had just come from living in Kenya. And while I was in the Herndon ashram, the place that Guru Jot Singh arranged for me to live was at your house, right? And I want to say you're like 9. You must have been like 8, 1977.
Yeah, it's pretty young. Yeah. I mean,
it was pre-India.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Very early on in those days. I mean, I think it could have been around, yeah, even as early as 7 or something. I seem to remember a Christmas present that coincided with your coming into my life that places us around 7 years old or so. So.
And that's what I remember. We had a Christmas celebration. We lived in the basement of your guys' house, which was this lovely house. It was probably the fanciest I had ever lived. And this is where, in my story, Faiswali got sponsored from Kenya, and we got a land in your house. And I totally remember your dad and your mom and you. And I remember him at Sing because his mom was also living in your house, right? Mm-hmm. Him and his mom, and she worked for Guru Jot Singh. So mm-hmm. The perspective there was, Guru Jot Singh had his connection in with making sure that the people that needed housing had it right there in the community. And your dad with your household was one of those people.
Yeah, I know. It's the story of my house in Herndon, I think, is a good way to think about the experience that I had. It's like a good my housing in Herndon and my family's housing in Herndon is an interesting lens through which to view my story.
Awesome.
Before you came and anybody came, the first person that lived in my house, well, actually, let's even go back before my parents lived in that house. That's where, like, Herndon was where like Siri Narankar and Gertej and a bunch of folks that were about, good 10 to however many 15 years older than me came to like go to community college and live. And so it was this sort of like um, halfway ashram between India and like the rest of the world.
Meaning those early kids that went to GNFC, when there
Exactly.
was that gap year where there wasn't really sure what they were doing, there ended up being this teen house that
Yep.
they were on their way to community college. Just so that people are hearing this, that year was in the 80s, right? Late 80s. A bunch of teenagers that were from India didn't know where to go, and Gurjot Singh kind of set up this house where a bunch of them lived, so to speak.
And I was born in the house opposite, like the house across the street from that. The reason I mentioned that house, though, is, I mean, it just sort of, Herndon is a really interesting place in the history of 3HO. It's like kind of becomes the major East Coast hub, I would say, of, probably the biggest ashram on the East Coast. And definitely the like longest lasting and sort of most durable with the most sort of like durable institutions. Um, and yeah, so I was born in that house across the street from there. I mean, next door to the teens' house was where Gurjot Singh lived, where literally months before I was born was when the raid happens on his home by the DEA, and for because he'd been entrapped in a hashish and weapons smuggling scheme, as you've talked about before on your show. So that's the sort of like 87 is when I come into the world, and I feel like that those kids are sort of like phasing out their time there, and your Joe, has been through this thing, and you're coming into the 90s when I feel like 3HO is coming into a new era where like you have, I don't know, it's like a lot more legitimate in a lot of ways. Like, instead of smuggling hash, like Gurjot and other men in the community built Health Scribe and these businesses that, interestingly, were also some of the first American businesses to start outsourcing to places like India. They were kind of on the cutting edge of that. So, yeah, and then my mom and dad were not in that circle. I mean, they were all friends and socially connected and all of that, but my dad was never much of a businessman, and he was a chiropractor. He loved to take care of people and help people out, and he never kind of amassed his fortune. He was always kind of, we were always check to check, I would say. Um, and that was another interesting dynamic, is that our household was always, we were less financially secure, certainly than, Gurjot Singh's household, but also the people connected to those businesses. Coincidentally, a lot of the people in the Herndon ashram came from money. So like, Gurjot's family, his wife's family, Satwant, who's, the head of the SSSC board, or the chairman, or whatever the title is, or the director. I don't remember. He's executive director, I think. So anyway, they're all folks that either came from some means or and were able to build upon those means. Whereas my family, and there were other families in the community that never quite were as wealthy, but I would say that ours was often always struggling. And so that was an interesting place to be. I remember kids, families going on vacation and things like that, or getting certain things. And it was by no means like I lived poor or anything like that. I lived a squarely middle class, in a middle class upbringing, but where a lot of my, neighbors went to the private Catholic school. I went to public school down the street, or that kind of thing. So So I think partly because of that, and I think the reason I think it's worth mentioning is our household, I think, was more ready to take on boarders to help cover costs. This is more occurring to me later in life. And before you came, there was a young woman who was from that same generation of kids that had lived in that house named Jai Jote from Amsterdam. I believe she was from Amsterdam. She was from Holland, and she'd gone to school in India, and she had come to live in our house. Apparently, you know, yeah, I don't know what exactly her story was, but I would say that the perception, the 3HO perception of her story at that time was she had some sort of a troubled family situation that required, where she kind of needed housing and like somewhere to land. And, upon growing up, we've learned, it's just a much more complex story that has to do with the dynamics of 3HO and family separation and parents who don't really look after their kids and all of that kind of stuff. So I always had that sense of folks being around and kind of this community as like intertwined with the lives of our family and everything like that. There wasn't, it's like looking at kind of how neighborhoods and how things work in mainstream life. You might know a few of your neighbors in the same block and might be close to them, but like, there's not this kind of broader sense of community necessarily around you. So I'd say from a very early age, you have this sense that you're a part of this thing and people are there and you're accountable to them. And it's a powerful dynamic. I mean, until and even into elementary school, I made a couple of friends from school, but the majority of my peer group is made up of 3HO kids. So I mean, it really was its own little world. Even though we weren't living on a commune somewhere, or we weren't in an Espanola kind of a situation or LA, where you have a kind of this really big active community that's like, ours was a little bit smaller, a little bit more like, integrated into the world around it because we just lived in a suburban neighborhood and, our families did business locally and all that kind of stuff. So, we were kind of living in between these worlds, but regardless, the majority of my life was 3HO and 3HO people, and my life calendar revolved around 3HO stuff, most of the time. And Herndon was a cool place to grow up in a lot of ways. I think like there was a lot of, kids would go outside every day and play sports with each other. You had some of when the older kids started coming back from school in India, you got that kind of bullying starting to happen and that roughness kind of get introduced. And that was definitely like noticeable, but you kind of maneuvered around it. And so there was a lot of good things about growing up there in terms of just like community and being active outside and just having a lot of friends and stuff like that. I was super overweight starting from about age 7 or a little bit older. And I was like, mercilessly made fun of by kids that were, most of the time it was instigated by older kids, especially the ones coming back from India. So I started to experience that sort of like kind of harsh edge of that world at home before I ever started going there to school in India. I mean, I went to Khalsa school, preschool. But then when I did go to public school, I also experienced, prejudice or whatever against my turban and my name and stuff like that. And, there were older kids at the school that would call me, all kinds of horrible names like raghead and sand N-word and all kinds of messed up stuff and also get made fun of for being overweight. So I think from a pretty young age, I experienced a lot of like negative attention from people around me for the way that I looked, and in multiple different ways and from different directions. So
Mm-hmm.
I also grew up in a household that was like very tumultuous. Like my parents, had a really poor communication, and there was arguing, and there was this insecurity about money and things like that. So I'd say I was born into like a pretty kind of insecure and like kind of scary position from a young age, and that's just sort of how things unfolded. And um,
I want to pause you and just acknowledge you said so much, but you've
yeah,
brought up some really key themes that I just kind of want us to pause on. Um, you spoke about your father and your mother, and just the household itself wasn't of the most prominent of the community, and how Herndon, what it represented as a body of an ashram on the East Coast, but also who Guru Jot Singh was, right, by this time. And so within the landscape of the ethos of your ashram, there was very much the households that were economically well off, had come from money, and or who had built wealth along the way, and then those same families in that cul-de-sac that very much didn't, and then how the chess moves are used on the poorer ones in our community in 3HO, and the history of it, that it's not unique to Herndon, but it played out super publicly in a way in Herndon that I think helps to illuminate a 3HO system around the haves and the have-nots, and how the successful business people could use the yoga teachers and the big-hearted healers, the chiropractors, or the school teachers, um, as pawns a bit for schemes that the big-hearted people didn't even see going on, because they just think it's this healthy, happy, holy community.
that's yeah, it's definitely an important thing to bring up, because it's like, my dad to this day can't accept any of the reports of harm. My mom, she's more open to that truth, and has kind of, told me about her feelings about the whole situation. Um, but with my dad, it's like neither of them ever witnessed anything that they thought was untoward. My dad did work in the toner businesses, and I think he does know that they were fraudulent. But aside from that, he was, again, and he was a guy on the phones. He wasn't like some manager. He was an employee, from a young age. They both also worked in like the Golden Temple restaurants, making less than nothing, and in exchange, I guess, for room and board at the ashram houses. And for them, of course, they talk about it in glowing terms, and how it was this like crucible of kind of spiritual um, community, that, especially in the early days, the way that they talk about it is like a very, it's like oasis in a desert. I can really, I think I can really identify that, and like identify with that and empathize with it. I think like and I like, honestly, I have a lot of, despite the many criticisms and all the things that we'll talk about, I have a lot of admiration for their like courage to like step out in a direction that was so unlike the world that they were raised in. But
Mm.
getting back to like uh getting back to the point that you made, it's like, yeah, they were really like true believers, really like just earnest people. My parents never had, I don't know, I don't think either of them have ever wronged anybody on purpose, or swindled, or they're really kind of just decent people, like in the
And how
most sort of,
many in 3HO are representative of that? Like, to me, I think that it's like, wow,
absolutely, yeah,
that
dig
big-hearted person that just thought they were doing the right thing and trusted the leaders,
right.
that these things couldn't possibly be corrupt. And enough of that, if you go through that enough years, how do you dig your head out of that, you
And,
know?
and like I said, I think it's like there was uh I like the analogy of like the wolf, the sheepdogs, and the sheep. And the wolf is Yogi Bhajan, and he sort of knows the plan, and he's the big alpha. And then you have the sheepdogs who know how to follow his commands, and they don't have scruples about mistreating others. And then you have the sheep who are, everybody else. I also don't mean for that to be degrading towards the folks that I classify in that sheep category, because quite frankly, that's how the entire planet functions, and the vast majority of us are in that subordinated, powerless position. So
Mm, so,
it's like it's important to take note of,
absolutely.
um, and so yeah. I mean, that was the atmosphere and kind of the class,
The
you know,
class, the
structure of
class
that.
hierarchy, the class structure. I also
Purely,
want to bring up another element that I'm wondering if you can speak to, is that your mom is French, and just wondering what that story is. Not that you're here to tell her story, but how your parents ended up, because that was one thing that they were so different, and so that also adding to the climate of your household and what was really going on. Financial insecurity, I feel like, was one way that a lot of households were kept unstable in 3HO. So it was a bit, I see it more purposeful than I ever did growing up before.
yeah,
Um, but then
yeah.
also just the couple connection, because that played out through your whole childhood. Like even your mom, I remember just the 6 months or short time I was there, she was always on your dad's case around his diet and his eating and your eating and this whole thing around being too fat and all this stuff. And she's like quite thin, and you could
Yeah.
feel the love they had between each other, but you could also feel that there was the built-in tension, which I'm seeing also as a 3HO theme and not
Hmm.
necessarily unique to a household. But I don't know your
Yeah.
parents' background, so I was curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's 3HO, but I feel like it's okay. So the thing that makes it 3HO specific is maybe there's less of a okay. So just rewind.
Yeah.
My mother's born and raised outside of Paris. She, from a young age, is fascinated by anything to do with the East. She talks about seeing Bruce Lee movies or Kung Fu, that TV show with what was his name, David Carradine, and how it, or like when she started getting into the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and hearing sitar and stuff like that, it just totally blew her mind. She tells stories of how she used to practice breath control without even knowing what it was. She would just try to like control her breath and breathe very long and deep and kind of meditate without ever even hearing about what that was. And so and she had this intense connection with nature where she would literally walk into the forest and talk to trees and like hug them and like sit with them. And people thought she was like people thought she was crazy because she just was different. She just like had this sort of subtlety and connection with the world around her, and an extremely like a very poetic kind of romantic, smart, artistic person who was, I mean, she's in France, but she's not. It's not like she's living in a hip neighborhood in Paris. Surrounded, she's in kind of middle class, sort of the equivalent of the suburbs and of a major city of America in France. So she goes through that kind of struggle of kind of her parents wanting her to get help and like her being like, I'm not crazy. I just, these are the things that I feel. And she went to fashion school and in Paris. And then a boyfriend and her at the time decided to go buy land in like the mid 70s when she's like 21 years old, um, buy land to India. And so her and her boyfriend, like, basically through like train and hitchhiking, go through Eastern Europe, through Turkey, through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, into Amritsar in like 1976. And she goes to the Golden Temple, like that's her first port of landing or whatever in Amritsar or in India. And she just said she just had this like feeling that she had arrived home after a long time, and finally felt a sort of like she was, her thirst was quenched or something. And she had no idea what it was. She didn't understand the language. She didn't know anything. She didn't know the word Sikh. She just happened upon this place and had this like, mystical experience basically. And then she traveled around India for a year, and that's a whole incredible story that I wish she would write down, because she met Shivite sadhus in the middle of the jungle. She met like indigenous people who like worshipped a goat that they kept in like a special like temple like tent. She like lived on the beach in Goa in the mid 70s. Like she, had this, and then she ends up kind of getting mixed up with some unsavory kind of gangster drug smuggler types in Bombay. And at first thinking that like just through the social scene in Bombay, and then she realizes that basically they're trying to get her to like, commit crimes for them, and so she has to like escape back to France. And it's a whole incredible, and just so happens that like, there's this crazy story where she's like finds herself on the streets of Bombay with like, she has to leave her baggage behind because she has to get out of the place where she is like real quick because someone's coming, and she's
okay,
like wandering.
Mata. Okay.
I know. Well, it's interesting, but so she ends up getting picked up by an auto rickshaw driver who happens to be an Amritdhari Sikh in Bombay, which you don't see everywhere. And he takes her to like basically a women's shelter and makes sure that she gets checked in, and that's how she sort of regroups and gets her way back home. The first, within months of arriving back in Paris, she gets onto the metro and meets Guru Hanskar by chance on the metro, who's there hosting some yogi who's like a friend of Yogi Bhajan's. And my mom just says, "Take me with you." And that's like then she moves to Amsterdam, etc. And there you go. Moves to LA thinking she's just going to go there for 3 months to like check it out. And then here she is still in Herndon from that trip where she got married off to my dad, who, long story short, was a Jewish kid from outside of Baltimore who got into similar substances that his peers were getting into in the 60s, and had some experiences that were pretty powerful. And then, I think he was sort of moving towards a cliff in terms of his mental health and whatnot because of those experiences. And he met a friend of his turned him on to Kundalini yoga, and he ends up moving to the Baltimore ashram. Mm. In a very long story is short, and they both end up in LA, and they meet each other, and they like each other, and my dad has a crush on her, and basically like asks Yogi Bhajan if he can marry her, and he says sure, and gets permission from my grandfather and all of that. And my French grandparents fly to LA, my Jewish grandparents fly to LA, and Yogi Bhajan presides over their ceremony. And there's actually, I think, an audio, maybe even a video recording of it. So anyway, that they're in Proust Road, and they're in that world, and in order to be closer to the East Coast where my dad's family is, and where my mother's family is in France, obviously they moved to the Herndon ashram and have me. So I mean, the household I grew up in was these two like wildly different people, both creative, both very bright in their own ways, but like, you know, my dad's family did not know how to regulate their emotions at all, and they were probably all untreated various, you know, issues. And my dad has, you know, he went through crazy mood swings and stuff like that, and you know, had a really hard time dealing with criticism or like dealing with problems. He has, you know, he ate himself into, you know, oblivion. And my mom was watching all of this unfold. It's like, he's not a bad guy by any means. He's a great guy. You know, he's a very loving guy who I feel like never got real, like, where the maybe the 3HO part comes in, who knows, is getting care, you know, and how kind of psychological care wasn't something that our parents' generation were thinking about or were necessarily like encouraged to do. And you know, the yoga and the meditation and the lifestyle was sort of the answer for everything. So there is maybe some of that. But you know, my dad has siblings that certainly never touched this community, and they never got care either. So you know, and they're all they're
Mm-hmm.
so
I think what I
so
was feeling from the, thank you for the backstory, by the way, on both your mom and your father, and even just the way couples come together. Like there's just so many different versions of ways, and so that was helpful because it creates a product, right? It creates a product in a household. People come on very different paths and land in a place, and now they have to commingle. And I remember that about your parents, and I remember your father being just, humor was his mechanism. And so if we I see people having very different coping mechanisms, and humor, just like in any household, not unique to 3HO, can be used to avoid emotions we haven't ever been taught to regulate or feel.
yeah, absolutely, that's my dad in a nutshell. I mean, it's, you know, everything's a joke. And um you know, I mean, it's part of his superpowers too, right? Like it's why children like flock to him like Santa Claus. Like they love him because he just like knows how to make kids happy and laugh. And he has this ability to access like a childlike aspect of himself that a lot of people lose in their life, and that I think actually brings a lot of like joy and creativity to life that you miss out on if you kind of lose that element of yourself. And then the flip side of that is that you're childlike in other ways, and that you can't deal with, you know, when mom, or in this case your wife, says, you know, Bertrand, like you're eating yourself to death, and like, you know, we're spending, you know, we're spending more than we're taking in, and I'm freaked out, and like we need to get all of these things under control. And then he's like, well, you're, you know, you're being unfair to me, or you know, it's like it's hard to encapsulate a whole relationship. But
Yeah, and I
and
think I also just want to acknowledge that it's not your job to tell their story, and I didn't want you to
exactly,
go there. So I wanted you to know that I don't need you to do that, but I appreciate how much you've given the backstory to really help us feel the environment you came up in.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it was just, you know, that they just, there was a lot lacking in their communication, and it came out in these like outbursts that were really terrifying as a little kid, you know. And so I think there was a lot of insecurity. Like I had a lot of, at home there was always the fear of an outburst. Outside there was a fear of being picked on, or you know, and then in the community there was a fear of like doing something wrong, you know what I mean. And I remember when I would see Gurjot walk down the neighborhood, I'd be just terrified. Like it was just like so intense. um and there was and the way others treated him, of course, you know, rubs off on you, and the way people talk about others. And so I'd say that that kind of paints, you know, I think it does paint an accurate picture of the kind of like kid that I was, and the kind of surroundings I was in. And so I have and had similar to my dad, like that humor coping mechanism. Then I also had this like really intense sort of, I guess, artistic, creative, melancholic side of myself. And I'd say by age 12, I was experiencing like severe anxiety and depression before I even ever started going to India. But nobody would have identified that as that. And I didn't really know how to communicate it to anybody. I just felt like horrible all the time and didn't want to be at school. And yeah, I was super overweight. So India came up because
I want to
everybody else.
pause you before you go to move on to India. I want to acknowledge how you spoke to the community that you had in Virginia, where you lived in a cul-de-sac, and so the kids of the different ages, um, the people, basically only kids that weren't age of India were there. So there's a certain age group that's there, and then I'm in my 20s and I come and stay there, and I definitely was not a normal person coming. I'm wearing like more African style turbans and stuff like this, and I had dreadlocks too. And what I appreciated about your household was your dad kind of had a rebel spirit where it's just like everyone's welcome. He reminded me of the persona, and not unique to him, but the persona in 3HO of the Jerry Garcia type. He's the go with the flow, cool guy, plays the guitar, always makes the atmosphere. And to add that he was a chiropractor, which adds to kind of the big, robust energy that he holds. That's very 3HO chiropractor persona in my experience.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, it's so true. Like, it, there's a lot there. Like, yeah, I mean, I grew up watching every generation, like every kid a few years older than me starting to go to India. So it was just like, either you're going to go to India or you're not going to India, but that is a question and it's going to be answered. And going to India was definitely like like, I don't know, it felt like a brave decision, or it felt like the right kind of like the difficult but the correct decision. Even at the time I knew, you hear about kids getting beat up and all that kind of stuff. Like, I knew before I went there that it was abusive, but I didn't think about it that way. I thought about it as like a rite of passage, and I looked at these guys that were 5, 6 years older than I was, and they were listening to hip hop, and like they were, big, and they were, cursing, and they were tough, and they were skating, and they were super, like, I don't know, they were cool, kind of scary, but also sort of cool. And you feel like, yeah, I want to go toughen up. Like, I want to go get better. Obviously, like, right now, I'm putty, I'm weak, I'm soft, and you kind of recognize that toughness as something to aspire to. So for me, like, it was never really much of a question. I knew that I was going to go. Like, I wanted to go from pretty early on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's
Yeah.
the ethos I think we talked to. Like, you don't always know, but I know even as a kid that never went to India, it was something you always felt like you missed out on, because it's a part
Yeah.
of the ethos of what we all strive to be able to do. So hearing that you knew that there was bullying and these types of things that already existed, the rite of passage, that it goes to the Guru Gobind Singh warrior
Totally.
mentality built into the culture as well.
Totally. I mean, and also the thing that you mentioned about kind of the open-mindedness of my household, I would say that, like, I did feel lucky about that. Like, I wouldn't say my parents were necessarily like socially or politically, like, really, thinking or talking a lot about that, but at least it was like, they were clearly not only not racist but anti-racist, and I understood what racism was from a young age, and I like understood that different people are all acceptable, and I had some basic level of universality that I grew up with in that household, for sure. There was definitely like homophobia, though. Like, I remember, I remember when Will and Grace would come on television, and my mom would make a face or something, or conversations about what if Shepard was gay, and her being sad or something, about that. You also brought up, like, I guess before we go to India, I'll also briefly touch on sort of, I had kind of two worlds that I grew up in. One was 3HO, And then every summer of like my youth into my young adulthood, and I would go to France to visit my mom's family. And so for like a month at a time, I was speaking a different language. And so I was fluent in French, and I would be around no one else who was in 3HO, and people would ask me about it all the time. So I'd be talking about it all the time. And I know it's funny, you know, I look back and I kind of realize like what I was crafting this sort of narrative of who I was, and based on what I should be saying, and it had nothing to do with how I felt. You know, it was had way more to do with an image that I felt like I had to craft about why I did what I did and who I was, and I had to argue these positions about all kinds of, you know, sex before marriage or whatever. So it was interesting that I had this other side of my world where all of this was like under question, and where you know, my cousins, for example, you know, were my a lot of my family on my mom's side are like, you know, socialists, like they're or you know, social democrats. They're totally evolved, you know, from a way before many others were, just on things like issues of race and queerness and all that kind of stuff. And so that's like the worlds I was living in between. And there was definitely like, looking back once again, I think there was a lot of yeah, people were posing questions that definitely were making me think and really consider why I was doing what I was doing. And in some ways that was really powerful, because I look back at it and I go, like maybe it was unlocking things that I wasn't quite aware of. And at the same time, it got, I think by my nature, I like an argument, or I like to construct an argument, or I like to make a point. I like to write, and I like to, you know, encapsulate ideas and express them. And so my intellectual self took those challenges and actually built up really strong defenses. And I would try as hard as I could to really come at being in 3HO and a Sikh and all of that from as logical of a place as I could. And so in some ways, mentality wise, I feel like I was different than some of my peers, because I had this perspective from my French side. And at the same time, I was like really staunch in my beliefs, because I was spent all this time like building, like trying to craft strong arguments and like really arguing them and holding to them in the face of questioning.
And so young. I want to make 2 points on that. One is, I feel like as children growing up in this dharma, we learn such pridefulness, right? So to have to explain things young is a part of establishing such depth of pride of being different.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going into my every year in elementary school, I was one of two Sikhs in the school. And at the beginning of the school year, the teachers would ask me to give a short talk on Sikhism to the class, to explain why I wore a turban and like my name and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was they were trying to do something good. I mean, I think if you did that now, people would go, you know, this is obviously like
emotional labor of a child.
yeah, and like, you know, Trump could be traumatizing and all this kind of stuff. And I was lucky because like most of the kids that I went to school with were nice in my class, in my age range and whatnot, and they were mostly just curious, and it opened up conversation. And you know, it was my teacher's effort to try to like get ahead of kids
making fun of you, sure.
Right.
Yeah, so, just the depth of pride. I remember that in going to elementary school too, in being one of the only Sikh kids, and just the amount of like, you know, why do you wear that thing on your head? Because it's a part of our religion. And you just, the steadfastness and like I feel it in my body as like ferocity to have to explain my name and everything we stand for. And
Yeah.
it's just been a lot to let it go over time.
Yeah, and yes, I don't know. I was going to go on another tangent, but I don't think it's worth it. It's like, but that pride was definitely instilled from a young age, and the way that my mind reacted to that was to, yeah, really try to construct like strong logic and arguments for why I am who I am and do what I do, and
And how
it's so
much
fun.
we were taught that as kids. Like, I really don't even think it's as personal as much as I feel like our parents look to us as that in how the teachings were played out. But I want to go to the added point you made about your mom still had very much a French identity and linked to her French family. And this is a unique
Totally.
element, I feel like, in your story than in a lot of our stories, because it's quite unique for a woman like your mom to still maintain a sense of identity that isn't only 3HO. And yet there was always that flavor to her. And so hearing her backstory, that it was her journey and her exploration, and then how she landed in the 3HO world, it just makes a little more sense, because that is unique to your story, that it wasn't, as much as it's this ferocity of 3HO, it's also this uniqueness where you got a little 1 month a year deculting and getting to have some culture.
Well, yeah, and French culture is definitely like the debate around the dinner table is like a huge, like having discord in the family over issues and like arguing to the end of a point is so normal. And it's like
Interesting.
it's like a just a part of culture there. Like, when people get together for a soiree, it's not to like get shit faced on like bad beer and party. It's like to, I mean, of course everybody does that everywhere.
Intellectually banter.
That's universal actually. But there's also like, come over, bring something, a bite to eat, or have a glass of wine, let's talk. And it's like 8 people just talking all night, and I still have not, to this day, like even among, in college or in places where you might think those kinds of things happens, it was never quite the same as in France. And it really is like a part of the culture. So I think like fucking arguing is really, and I'm also Jewish, so it's like, so like I definitely have this like combative sort of aspect to the way I think, and that's sort of how I set my mind up to like respond to the world around me. But the
Mm-hmm.
point that you're making of having a source of identity outside of 3HO, I think makes that's really important, because my mom, she had that French identity. Like I said, she had this experience, that she had this mystical experience outside of the context of 3HO. And to this day, and now I think like she has a much easier time sort of speaking about all of these things kind of more honestly, and ceding ground and being like, no, this is certainly all possible. And this is like, if so many people are reporting it, how can you deny it? And so it's more she can think about it more logically, because she always says, yes, he was a teacher and he was really important to things that I experienced, in this community and with him, but ultimately I always considered myself like a Sikh of the Guru before anything else. And actually that was kind of the mentality that I feel like I always felt like I was a Sikh before I was a 3HO person. I never really, especially after going to school in India, I started to kind
I was
of
going to
question.
ask, did that happen in India, or was that so you've led us well up to this 9 or 10 age where you end up going to India. Um, the last thing I want to just mention real quick is how much nostalgia your our parents' stories of their
Oh,
nostalgia story of how they landed, how that in and of itself is trauma related, right? How we can just stay in our nostalgia for so long. I know it helped me get through my 20s and 30s, the nostalgia of the community. Um, and seeing it for what it is opens up more compassion for these spaces, maybe.
oh yeah. I mean, big time. I definitely, it is. I have a hard time listening to the stories now, because that they're just so rose colored and so sort of um what's the word I'm looking for, curated. um, and and it's understandable. And
And
but
you
it
can see it as a symptom of CPTSD, right? You can see it as like
sure, sure, sure.
the
Yeah,
rose-colored
I mean,
stories get you through.
yeah. I mean, they both had really they had in different ways. They had difficult relationships with their families. They were both kind of seekers. They were both sort of out there. They were just a little different than kind of their families or the people around them. So, it made sense that that neither of them were like the sort of you hear a lot of stories like addiction and like hardcore abuse and stuff like that that kind of drove people or helped people
Land
find their way
people
to
in a
freedom.
community, right?
But they're you can definitely draw a line from their relationships, I think, to their families to kind of needing a different family.
Yeah, and I can also hear the theme that happened to a lot of our parents' generation in terms of the fetishization of Orientalism, just all the books and all the things, like how that ties into anti-racist language today, how there just ended up being this whole incubator that set people up like our parents because of the early Orientalism
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
literature.
important that's an important thing to remember because there's factors that are pushing all of these this whole situation forward that are much bigger than Yogi Bhajan or any of our families. I mean, there's a I did a whole 4 hour podcast on this, but like there's like there's godmen guru types going back to the early 1900s. Before that, you have spiritualism and people investigating, Whitman and investigating the Bhagavad Gita and all this kind of stuff. Um, and they they were primed, like they were, and it was tied to economics. This is the point I want to make: is like when a guru or somebody who was, had these mystical things to offer, it's like they would tailor their teachings based on what people wanted and what would draw people in. And so, you can read story after story about all these guys. Some of them, maybe they're legit, scholars of whatever, but a lot of them were like similar to Yogi Bhajan, where they're like kind of middle class guys who are kind of educated. So they speak English and they have some means, but they're kind of coming to America, like make their way. And maybe they took a yoga class or two and they remember what their grandpa taught them about Sikhism, or they were involved, or Hinduism or whatever, and they kind of create these personas. And so, and it's, and there's economic factors that are driving that, like I'm going to make money doing this, but then there's also like political factors going like what's legit, like what can an Indian person, what kind of work can they even do in this country, like until the early 1900s, Asian people can't own land in this country. There's like a period of time in the 20th century when uh, uh, Indian visas are basically like rescinded, and there's like people trapped in America that have to like make their way and figure out how to, So there's all these like bigger societal, political, economic, social factors that I think are pushing all this along. That it's important to like remember, because I feel like our story is kind of a microcosm of much bigger um, phenomenon that you see elsewhere. We're just easier to study because we all were connected and had this sort of unique identity.
Yeah, so well said.
Sorry, that was rambling.
That no, it's an excellent circle around because that's what we have to keep remembering. We have this personal experience that is very personalized in the landscape of a much larger socialization that's happened to generations before us. And when I start reading it from a larger lens, I'm like, well, no wonder this whole generation got caught up in that. And you can kind of track things. Um, but yeah, so you were just priming us for how you ended up going to India. And I don't know if you want to go there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, got an, really overweight, really insecure kid. I was 11. 1999 when I went there with, my dear friend Himmet, who you mentioned.
Now he was
Uh,
living with you because his mom was also living with you, and you guys were about the same age.
yeah, he's like 3 months younger. So we're basically the, same age.
And I
There's a
also
hand.
want to point out that both of you guys didn't have brothers, siblings. And so you guys grew up kind of it together, very sibling like.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he's definitely the closest thing to a sibling that I have. Um, and yeah, I mean, so we went together, and other kids in the neighborhood went. Some other kids were returning, who were older than us and who'd been there before. Some who were younger than me were also returning because they started going when they were 7 or 8 or whatever. And that was a absolutely kind of, just the trip there is definitely like, still seared into my memory. I remember, I definitely remember crying, and I remember getting on that plane, and both the kind of fear and the like excitement, were immediately there. You know, the way the older kids are interacting with you is already different. It's already a little bit more kind of sinister, or a little bit more kind of intense in terms of like their demeanor and their kind of that pecking order mentality. Is It's like you can just already start feeling it, and like feeling the kind of social dynamics already taking hold, like, and then especially once we like unite with people on the layover and people from other cities start joining us, and that bigger kind of social network starts to form, and then you land in Delhi and you get on the buses and everybody's back together and everything's back into that kind of mentality of like, might is right. Older kids, the stronger kids are in control. And I just remember being under like in fear from the minute I get onto those buses that pick us up in New Delhi and start driving to Amritsar. Like, kids, older. This is the first time that I've been really like bullied. I'm realizing, where like it's not like a joke, or like a joke at your expense, or teasing, or a passing kind of a thing that kind of makes you feel bad and it's to make other people laugh. No, this was like an older kid coming up to you in the dark, being like, "What food do you have?" And being like, "What are you talking about?" And they'd be like, "Open your backpack, like take out all of your snacks, take out, everything that you have. Okay, I'm taking this, I'm taking this." And then you say no, and you get slapped in the face for the first time, or punched for the first time, and like by a much bigger kid, hard, for the first time. And so all of that, like within moments, you're just like, okay, I'm on a new reality. I'm now, it's about survival. um and I didn't even have it. It was already less violent by the time I get there than even just a few years before, when kids are at A block, and where they don't even have a school, and they're just getting, people are being beaten near to death and stuff like that. And still, it was just, it was terrifying, and physically threatening quickly. um Merciless, like, just, especially being like overweight, from Virginia. The Virginia kids had a nickname that we all got upon arrival. Like any kid that would come from Virginia, we were called the VPs, the Virginia Pussies, because we were soft, and we were notoriously less tough, and
Was that
um
because it was considered to have more money out of that ashram, so to speak?
maybe, yeah, there
Like it
was
was
just,
more lush because you were in this nice suburb, so to speak?
all right. So yeah, I mean, the situation became very clear to me that, you know Mini Pity Academy was like not only a hard scramble place that I thought it was going to be, but it was a lot. It was just more than I could have really imagined growing up how I did in Herndon. I had experienced kids picking on me or teasing me, but I hadn't experienced like that, just total domination by someone else, because especially that first year, 1999, I'd say that, every year after that, the school was, there was more supervision and more sort of control of the kids, like whereabouts and stuff like that. But that first year I was there, if you, with a little bit of ingenuity, you could basically get around any kind of systems of monitoring or anything like that because it was so poorly run and understaffed. And so I remember within like 2 weeks of arriving, the beginning of the year, like before school had started, it was just like the Wild West. Like kids were staying up all night. Boys were sneaking over to the girls' dorm and vice versa. Um, I remember one night a bunch of the older kids like kind of rallied all of the boys in the dorm, and they like, we were all like kind of pulled out of our rooms by the older kids and brought into the center section of the dorm. And they had bought like tons of Indian firecrackers, which if you've never experienced, in America, folks, the biggest kind of little firecracker you can get is like an M80, which is like maybe the size of like a little battery, like a AA battery. And, you can buy things that are, 4 or 5 times that big, like basically a matchbox full of powder that's wrapped in like twine and sealed. So it's like hard. And those things were like little grenades. So they had gathered a ton of these like big, powerful firecrackers. They had made Molotov, like a couple of Molotov cocktails. And they were like, okay, here's the plan. Everybody gets some firecrackers, like one kid gets firecrackers, the other kid gets a lighter, and like you're gonna all run around campus and just like throw firecrackers all over the school, and we're gonna go throw these Molotov cocktails on the basketball court. And that's exactly what happened. So like, I just remember being like 11. I don't think I was qualified to be given firecrackers or anything yet. So I was just like running around screaming with the other kids, kind of just causing havoc. And actually, I I had just recently watched Guru Ganesh's episode where he talks about Akal Sahai. Akal Sahai was the staff there the first year that I was there, and he was like a big brother to me. But like in that moment, he was like staff. He's like a young man. There's kids like going nuts, and he just like ran past me and kind of shoulder tackled me to the ground, not like trying to hurt me, just like in panic, trying to get to the sort of center of what was going on. Wow. And I remember it ended when all the firecrackers run out and Molotov cocktails are thrown and all the staff are out and they kind of gather all the boys together. And I remember I was standing in the middle or sort of like set back from everybody. And Akal Sahai, was kind of reading everybody the riot act, like, what the hell are you guys doing? This is so dangerous. And like, somebody could have gotten their hand blown off and this is just so irresponsible. And then he looked at me and he was like, you too, Shubid? And I was just like, and I didn't even have the guts to say, yeah, I was so scared. I just was like, oh no, I just heard there was something going on outside and I came to check, I mean, just, so it just was, that's my introduction. And then we go to the Himalayas and we go hike up to Hemkund Sahib, which is like pretty serious trek, 2 serious treks, 2 days in a row. And I'm so out of shape and I'm sick. I'm like, I have the runs and I can't walk up the hill. They put me on a donkey. I'm getting absolutely just made fun of because I have to ride a donkey. On the way down, the donkey bucks me off and like pulls me down the trail. It's like, what else? Like, at nighttime when we're all sleeping while we're on this trip, we don't have individual dorms. So all the boys and girls are just sleeping in these big halls, like in their sleeping bags on like with like a camping mat. Uh, and like, you know, the staff, the older kind of male staff are sleeping at the doorway. There's like not even a door on the place. It's just like an open thing. And I remember one kid going and peeing into a water bottle and pouring it all over the commandant, who was the weirdo ex-Marine that was hired to be our principal, who's also like a right-wing psycho. He, yeah, Fred Jameson. He's still around. If he sees this, hi, Fred, you have terrible politics, but I wish you the best. But he, you know, nobody liked him. So this other kid goes and pees in a bottle and pours it all over this guy's like sheepskin and sleeping bag and his bag and everything. And then he goes and he finds a stray dog in the neighborhood and he lures it to the guy's sleeping bag with like a treat or like some food or something. And he kind of like puts some water there or something for him to chill out. So it looks like the dog did it or something. I don't know. This was his like brilliant. The funny thing was, is that commandant immediately knew who it was and that it was not the dog, and saw what happened, immediately walked over to the kid that did it and was like, I know you did this, you know, and
Wow.
gave him some kind of a, you know, he had to go run a bunch of miles or something, who knows what. But you know, this is the kind of the mentality that I'm coming into. I mean, what that did to me, what that year and those years did to me, it's hard to even fathom how much those experiences kind of imprinted on me. You know, like, you know, I was 11. I was 11 years old. I remember being brought by some of the older kids to go jump over the wall at nighttime and walk into town and buy alcohol and go like drink it. I'm like 11, you know, and I remember coming back from lunch break and my roommate, you know, we had bought hashish when we had just been on our spring vacation to Dharamshala, and you know, I hit my first hash pipe at age 11 in my dorms before I went to Uncle Sat Hanuman's. He was a visiting teacher who taught us about the Civil War, and I went and I aced his final exam when I was just completely stoned, and I accepted an award from him in front of the whole school. Like shortly thereafter, he was like leaving town and giving me an award in front of the whole school, and I'm just completely stoned. And I don't know, you know, it's, you know, and then so you're experiencing all of this sort of chaos, you know, but then at the same time you're going to the Golden Temple multiple times a week and you're madly in love with it, you know. I mean, there's no denying it. Like I built a real loving kind of connection to that place that I still feel, you know, and you get to know people that you do seva with, and you learn your little bits of Punjabi, and it just totally, you know, whatever mind I went there with was different, you know, when it came back, because you're just being, and this isn't necessarily a negative thing. Obviously, there's a ton of negative stuff that I described there, but the positive, I guess, side of all of this is that I don't know, maybe not everybody reacted this way, but I definitely, it was like, oh, my perception of the world is extremely limited. You know, my experience of the world is very particular. And, you know, I can look at the street and I can see that, like, you know, that guy didn't ask to be a beggar. That person didn't ask to be born into the situation they were born in. And I do remember being there and going back to America every year, and sort of that the austerity that I lived in India, and the sort of tough kind of living circumstances, but also witnessing the kind of poverty and the need in India, and then going back to Northern Virginia, literally like one of the richest counties in America, and going shopping at the mall and stuff like that. I remember being like raging mad when I would go to the shopping mall and I would see, you know, just the disparity, you know, and I didn't really couldn't make heads or tails of why things were the way they were, certainly, but it definitely instilled a really deep sense of like, I don't know, some on some level, like, that kind of the world operates on injustice, or just isn't fair in any way, and that was really powerful. So I think that definitely impacted me in terms of the way I looked at the world, and I looked at people and cultures and history and politics, even if I wasn't conceptualizing it all at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that was fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also a lot of trauma. There was also kind of there was an unconscious sort of just a white sort of colonial mentality that the staff had, that we had, about Indian people. And um, there was there was a it was a very unique psychology to develop in that place, where on one hand, you're when you're weak and you're small, you're uh, in fear and you're under threat. But as soon as you're big enough, you do the same thing to others to carve out your own sort of zone of security and power. But then also, like, so sort of like experiencing what it's like to be mistreated, but then, and sort of having maybe some empathy for that, but then just immediately recognizing that the safest way to proceed was to make yourself as tough and sort of horrible as you could. And and I mistreated kids younger than me. I remember my first year there, I tried to pick a fight with a kid who was, around my size, to like, just, I remember like walking around all day thinking to myself, like, I need to like increase my social credit or whatever. And like, a kid brushed against me in the hallway and I just punched him in the head. And, so I think like violence as like just a readily accessible form of communication was pretty uh, was a big part of how we talk to each other.
And
uh,
implemented, you learned that social order real fast.
Instantly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you didn't learn it.
Who was the staff when you were there?
So it was Commandant Fred Jameson, Jagat Guru. He was there, maybe it was his third year as a staff there. Amrit Singh Reinch, it was his first year there. Um, he was there for a long time. And then Akal Sahai was there. Um, I think Paramatma, late Paramatma, was there. I think he was a teacher, and like he took care of the younger kids. He was always, a kind of a safety, like him and Akal Sahai were definitely always sources of safety. Um, who else was there? Those are the people that Jagat Guru's wife, Guru Dev. Um, yeah.
You had
Yeah. I mean,
mentioned going back home every year. So, um, from age 11, you went back for vacation and then was able to. So, kids didn't stay there for long, like 8 years
right.
periods of time.
Right.
Everybody already went back during MPA.
Yeah. So we would, the school year was in India and then summer break was at home.
Okay. So, that had changed from the early days of GNFC. That
Right.
was a part of what had changed.
Right. And which did afford me opportunities to like, hang out with my friends from elementary school who were going through their lives. And a lot of those relationships kind of disappeared, but I did maintain a couple that I still have to this day. And then, and then I'd see my family in France, or I'd do summer camps and stuff where I'd, at the local public community center, and you'd interact with kids there. So I definitely look back and I'm grateful that I had that, because at least I didn't feel completely alien from the people around me when I finished school in India. I
Yeah, like
wasn't
come
going
back to a
home.
foreign country, which is America after 8 years
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
overseas. Um,
Go to
the next
France.
thing question I had, and you may not know the answer, but I was just curious if you know how your parents afforded sending you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that back then the tuition was only a few $1,000s a year. It was much lower than it became. Uh, like by like the time I was teaching there, it was like almost like a normal private school in terms of the like it was more in the tens of thousands of dollars a year. Whereas when I was going there, I think it was a few, and there we were maybe even given a lower rate because of my parents' income or something. So I don't know how much it was, but both my parents worked jobs. You know, my dad ran his chiropractic business. My mom worked for all different kinds of jobs, including for him, but also other things. And I mean, frankly, they afforded it probably by hook and by crook and credit cards and all kinds of stuff because after my second year at school in India, they had to, or during my second year at school in India, they actually switched houses with the people across the street from us. And the people that lived across the street from us were Guru Amrit Singh and Omkar, who, you know, many might know are at some of the core kind of members of the like Yogi Bhajan, whatever, um, you know, community group that's, you know, in complete denial of any of the reports of harm. And um, so they had two kids. I was an only child. So what happened was is my dad basically couldn't pay his mortgage, and instead of losing the house and having to find somewhere else, people in the community came together, and Guru Amrit Singh and Onkar basically said, look, we have the cash to put a down payment down on your guys' house. Why don't you guys move into our current house, which is the one across the street from where I grew up, and we'll move into yours, and you can just pay us kind of like a handshake rent that's kind of, you know, a little bit below market value, and you know, you don't have to sign a lease, and in a few years when you've built up, you know, kind of stabilized financially, we can count your rent towards as like a, you know, payment towards owning the home. And so, you know, at that time, it's like, wow, that's pretty cool, you know, that the community comes together to make sure that we can stay there. And they're even creating this avenue to where my dad can get back on the property, owning a house and all of that, um, and whatnot. Um, and that story doesn't end there. But for many years, we live in that home, paying rent to Onkar and Guru Amrit. And my dad does go back to Guru Amrit a couple of years later when he has some cash saved up, and Guru Amrit reneges on the deal. And Guru Amrit says, I never said that, and basically dismisses my dad.
I'm
So,
disgusted. I just want to pause on the disgust
yeah,
I'm feeling.
he's, you know, I have no admiration or respect for Onkar and Guru Amrit. I think that they're really privileged, self-centered people um, who are showing their true colors now when they're investing their time and energy into ensuring or in trying to stop any kind of meaningful change in this community, and are participating in, you know, denying these people's stories of abuse. Like,
And
so
actively denying and actively pushing against. And a couple more things I want to say on that. I lived there and I took care of their kids, Sebong being one of them. I forget their other son's name. Um,
under.
Satmander. Satmander. I remember both those, Sebong and Satmander. I also remember Onkar being one of my guides at ladies camp because she was like this really starch, military, like, and so I was so surprised to see them in the community at that time. But I want to really bring up that I just remember how nice your home was. And so to hear this story and the distortion that I'm feeling around it, it was the nicest basement I had ever stayed in, and I was just in the basement. So like the whole house was multi-storied, and there was just some pride in it around the beauty of your household. And I remember your mom really appreciated her home, even though, as a household, you had to rent to other people and all the things. But there were, like you said, other households in the community that definitely didn't have to do that. And then for that to be the house they buy and have it be come across that it's all so benevolent, we're doing this for you. And once again, it just feels like it goes to the sinister quality that repeats itself in 3HO around the haves doing of things of good service on behalf of the have-nots, when really that service was never service. It was the fraud, it was the business deals, it was encouraging people to give up their mortgages to help the Gurujot Singh scenario. But the people that were signing over their mortgage didn't really even know the real story, so they think they're doing good. Anyway, that's what that whole thing reminded me of.
Know about that whole story. I was obviously before my time, but I heard about that on the Gurganesha episode, and I were hearing about that growing up, and it definitely has like a certain symmetry to it, right? I mean, so what, long story short, I mean, this is long after I leave India, long after India and a lot of years. This is actually just in the last, this is like what, 2017. My dad was in very poor health. He could barely run his business. My mom was working for him, and so their income was through the clinic. And with about, I think it was 2 months' notice, Onkar and Gurumar told us that they were selling the house. So, they, at one point, I was so incensed. I was so angry. I was so deeply, deeply angry, because it was, not only was it like, obviously it was dishonorable to say we can basically do like rent to buy, and and then to renege on it, that's obviously super shitty. But at the same time, then to like be selling the house out from under us when like my dad is in severely poor health and struggling financially, after we've never missed rent. We'd been in there since like 2003, which means, we put probably close to almost like $400,000 into that house, or maybe like $500,000 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's, which should have paid for the house. But the brilliant business minds of Onkar and Gurumar decided to start a mortgage processing company in 2007, just before the financial crash, which many economists were already beginning to predict. But they decided that was a good use of their money because they're brilliant business people. And guess what? Their entire business crashed, and they lost all of their money. And without telling us, they put the house that we were living in on a second mortgage, or they used it as collateral to borrow money from Gurumar Singh's mother, who inherited huge amounts of wealth. They're descended from literal copper barons. He used the money to borrow money from his own mother's trust, and the mother's trust was, in 2017, was finally coming back to collect, and they hadn't made back the money to pay it because their business crashed. And so they needed to sell the house. They needed to sell the house. Meanwhile, their children each own multiple homes. And they're literal, like, the robber barons of the early 20th century is who they are descended from. His
wow.
great-great-grandfather discovered a copper mine and exploited it at the when the telegram started to be created. So that's the kind of that they have. And so in normal society, they don't owe us anything, obviously. What they did for us was nice.
Right.
For what we're supposed to be to each other, ostensibly as a community and as 3HO, was in that moment, I was already deeply questioning a lot with this community, but that was almost like like the fruiting of this long story that goes back to the beginning of it all, and it was a real powerful, painful awakening to the callous indifference of people that are supposed to be like your family, but who ultimately are governed by the same mentalities that they claimed to be rejecting in part of joining this community. And it's not just them, it's all of us. I mean, we're all created in this soup of racism and, patriarchy and capitalism and all of this kind of stuff. And we can't escape it, but they really thought that they were doing something revolutionary, and it had no political ideology. It had no social ideology. It was purely just following a guy and doing the stuff that makes you feel better about yourself. And all of that came crashing down. I feel like it was already crumbling. And then in those moments, it was just like really laid naked of how like far from the stated aspirations of the community this situation was.
Yeah.
And that was very powerful. And I think it's like, I know we've skipped far ahead, so if we can rewind a little bit. But my time in India, I think that I feel like what I've shared about my time in India gets across how it affected me. I experienced sexual assault there. I was assaulted, and
by another student.
Yeah, by an older student.
I'm
sorry. With a Sharpie, with a marker, and in my sleep, I
You mean abusing your body with a Sharpie while you're sleeping by another person?
Yeah, by
an older boy student.
Yeah. So
wow.
I experienced being held, both of my arms behind me by a bigger kid, while another bigger kid stood in front of me and, punched me in the face and wouldn't let me leave until I stood still and accepted the punch at full force. I was, and then I beat up little kids. I was 15 or whatever, and I would, take a young, a 10-year-old, and I would, starting out as a joke, goof around with them, and then it would turn physical and violent, and I'd push them to the ground, or I'd slap them or whatever. And it was just like a part of that culture. It was a way to get off your own anger and frustration. And yeah, and India really, I think I was really depressed there. By the end of my time in India, I would do everything I possibly could to get out of whatever the activities were. I wanted to stay in my room, in bed all the time. I didn't want to do anything. It was like and there's obviously some wonderful stuff to it, some really incredible life forever that I'll always remember, friends I'll always have, things I would have never experienced or seen, but as an institution and as the way it functioned off of violence and intimidation. And that was from staff to students and older students to younger students. There's a million stories of kids getting beaten up by staff. I was physically pushed around by Jagat Guru. I was never like actually beaten up, but I definitely know of other kids that were by actual staff members long into the history of the school until very recently. You had people at the school who had multiple, reports of abuse. When I was a teacher there, I was witnessing adults, physically accosting students who were, not obeying or whatever. So, or just even straight up out of like anger and rage. So it was a violent place that rewarded obedience to the people, to the leadership, rewarded a certain presentation of oneself as a certain kind of Sikh yogi, tough thing. I think it was a really tough place for the women in the school, for the girls in the school, because it was such a hyper masculine environment. And our sex education was Yogi Bhajan's like humanology courses, so we were learning about auras and like why, how your aura is imprinted. A woman's aura is imprinted by a man's for 6 years if she's intimate with him, but it only imprints onto the man for 90 days. And this kind of like intense like feeling, like fear around like your sexuality and your relationship to women. And it's like such a head trip. So that's affects the way I interact with the world, after that as well. So a lot of foundational things that I would have, I think I would have been starving for just a nurturing, safer environment. There's nothing wrong with being challenged and your limits pushed and taken out of your comfort zone. And the world is a scary place, a crazy place, and bad things can happen anywhere in the world. But like by design and institutionally how it was structured, this place was just like, it was an abusive thing, and people were decrying it and calling for change as long as I can remember. I remember parents who would come there and they would believe their kids and they would, take issue. But incremental changes happened throughout the years. I was there again in 2011, 2012 as a teacher, and I had just come from studying urban planning and public policy and nonprofit management. So I knew a little bit about how you operate, organizations and how I had some ideas of, effective methods for teaching and operating programs. And when I went to the school in India, I was after college, I was just like, man, this place is like, the incentives are really messed up here. This kind of punishment reward system is messed up. There's like extreme favoritism between, Jagat Guru, who's kind of has this interesting like social capital and power, and who we looked up to as almost like our like Yogi Bhajan or our spiritual teacher when we were kids there. And I saw like how it's like whatever its stated purpose was, it was not, I don't know, it just was not instilling a lesson. It wasn't creating independent thinkers. It wasn't like nurturing people. It was just still like indoctrination, mediocre K-12 education, and like an extremely busy schedule that run by people who absolutely had less than zero education or training about caretaking young people or young people's psychology or education. They have no business doing what they're doing, and they were doing it for decades, and it was just like operating off of like a few people's notions of how things should be. And and then, ostensibly you have a board structure that's meant to keep them in some kind of check, but ultimately those people were sycophants and were essentially going along with like what the recommendations were coming from the school, which were self-supporting, and so that drove me nuts when I worked there for a couple of years, and that was definitely the beginning of the end, I would say, of like my kind of last sort of faith in anything of what we'd been raised with, and seeing like, again, it's like there's nothing. What's hard to kind of say, what can get lost is that I don't think that anybody in this configuration, except for maybe Yogi Bhajan and a handful of people around him, were doing anything nefarious. Like, I think that Jagat Guru oversaw a horrible program and, essentially contributed to abuse. And the same way, hell, that I did when I got older as a student and I start beating up younger kids, he's just further along down the road, and he never left. He just
and more entrenched and more lifted, right? And more centering around him to kind of like help to put him in this position. If I'm understanding, Jagat Guru and Guru Dev went over to India at around 19-ish. I mean, they graduated the program and then very quickly got sent over there, married young, around 18-ish, because she was my best friend at the time. I even have letters of her writing to me saying, me and Jagaguru are in love, and I realize this is our life now, and going to India is what it's all about. And, just this whole fantastical, and they were young. So I think you're pointing out something very important, that, he was a kid that went through it, and then he gets put into a position. And as any yoga teacher in the guru demagogue world that we come from, there is something about a following that when the following starts doing that to you, it's hard not to accept it and then to live into that. And then he's trying to live up to an image in which he has to then uphold no education, no background, no training. And yet he's then put into this posture to probably by YB to make MPA what it's supposed to be. So he's given a guruship in a way to do an impossible task because he's not equipped, he's not trained, he has his own complex trauma that's never been addressed, and probably so many more things you could add to that.
Yeah. And so at the time, though, I was just angry, and I kind of centered my anger at him because I saw him.
You mean while you're teaching, while you're
Yes.
over there? Okay. I want you to explain that. I also want you to explain how you ended up going there to teach.
Yeah. I mean, how did I end up going there to teach? Is sort of feels sort of like the same way of how I ended up going there to school. Of like, when I graduated from school in India and I went to college, I had the idea then to go back to school in India and try to teach there. And I thought that the thing that was missing there was education and knowledge, not that it was built in such a way to be how it was.
Right.
So it was really like altruistic, actually. It was like, I'm gonna, and it was naive and kind of like, I'm gonna go get educated, and I'm gonna be the kind of synthesis, that believes like that there's something redeeming in MPA, and I developed a deeper understanding and reading of like Sikhism and Sikh history in that time as well, like after school in India. So I was like we should have a deeper connection to Punjabi history and society and culture. And I feel like I lived in India for all this time, but I walked out with such little cultural understanding or education, and like a very minimal understanding of even like the history and the philosophy. It was like, a lot of Yogi Bhajan stuff, and then a lot of like, okay, we're going to the Golden Temple. Okay, this is how you read Punjabi. This is how you read Abani. But there was nothing much deeper. It was sort of like activities to, or practices to add to your list of practices. It wasn't like, let's develop like an intellectual relationship and a social relationship with this world that we claim to be a part of as Sikhs. And I kind of like the going back to like how I was all about constructing a logical argument, I was sort of like, oh, you guys aren't even, I was almost like, I'm actually a truer believer than you, because I care so much about what we have that I'm willing to ask difficult questions, and I'm willing to investigate, I'm willing to like learn from different sources and look outside of the like universe that we grew up in and go, where else can we find Sikh education, and how can we like really give people a more meaningful connection to Punjab and Sikhs and Sikhism. And so it was like, actually, it was out of like really deep faith that I wanted to go back there, but with a sort of like a critical mission involved, or like that had this sort of criticism built into it. But then I went and tried to do that, and it's like you're just running against a brick wall,
Mm.
you know, and I think that anger towards Jagaguru developed because I couldn't really conceive of the problem outside of this little microcosm of the school, and that, it was hard for me to kind of like, I just didn't have a wide enough awareness to kind of go, oh, this is a systemic problem that starts much deeper. So yeah, I mean, that was that year. I I was ready to completely disconnect right then and there. Like after that school year, I was like ready to, I had the idea in my mind to just completely like shave all of my hair and my, everything off and disconnect from all of it. And even though I still like had a deep kind of affection or affinity to Sikhism, I was like, I need to kind of like build my own Sikh identity, my own like relationship to this religion. And I want to just sort of like start on my own and like make these choices on my own. And but it was coming from a very reactive, angry place, because I was like, fuck this. This is like so backwards, and it's not how I think it should be run. And it doesn't seem like anybody actually wants to inquire how to make this place better or to eliminate, bullying and abuse. I don't know. And or kind of look at themselves and criticize ourselves and be like um transparent and humble. And I felt like, that I sort of was like, wasn't that kind of like what yoga and meditation is supposed to be about, is like surmounting the ego and like, you know um going beyond these sort of attachments to tradition or to um, norms, and really just going, what is the correct action based on my values and the circumstances, using like clear mind.
Mm.
And so I was just like, I was so earnest. It was just so like genuine, of like I really believe in all this stuff so much and I'm so disappointed that you won't kind of like change
Yeah.
the way that you think or approach this problem to deal with it. But obviously that wasn't the diagnose. I wasn't diagnosing the problem correctly. So, I was ready to kind of like disconnect because I was just so angry and so frustrated and disappointed.
Mm.
And I reconnected with who was a woman who was my good friend and who is now my wife, Sukhmani. Was like at the end of that time in India, and she sort of walked me
Was
back
she
off.
was she at the school?
No, but she was at summer solstices every year
Got it.
for many. She was never really into 3HO or Kundalini yoga. She would just come to solstices, play music, and she wasn't really connected to it outside of literally that week. And she was friends with my friends. We were close in age, and we were both in, relationships and stuff. So we were always just platonic, friends for many years. And then it just so happened that she visited Amritsar that year where I was teaching, that second year where I taught. And we saw each other there and connected, and we had a really, kind of powerful intense conversations about all kinds of stuff. We were both going through big kind of changes in our lives, and I think that, you know, she recognized that anger in me and that desire to sort of lash out and completely disconnect as having to do a lot more with my own trauma than necessarily like I needed to do. Or she just posed the question to me, like, you know, is that kind of really what you want to do, or is it more of like a just a reaction or something like that? And so I kind of like met, you know, I was like, okay, yeah, I don't need to like have this explosion, but I've had this experience and I have this point of view now. And, you know, the next several years of my life were really like the evolution of my relationship to Sick Bunny, where in like 2014 or 2012, when I finished my time in India, is like shortly after that is when we, you know, we were no longer in the relationships we were in. We were in a different time in our lives, and we reconnected at that summer solstice after I came back from India, and we were just like, I don't want to not see you anymore. And that was the beginning of our relationship, which, you know, 3HO plays a role in that in some ways. I mean, we wouldn't have met if it hadn't been for Solstice. She becomes the percussionist for Sanatam Kaur and for Ajit Kaur. And so that allows her to like travel and start making a living as a musician. And that travel allows us to see each other because it brings her to the East Coast in Virginia, where I moved back to after teaching at the school. And we're able to see each other there, and without going completely into our story of how we of that whole story, because it's just long and complex, and but circumstances basically forced us to elope, and so we eloped to Mexico together and lived in Mexico for 6 months in 2015-16, after I was, you know, going through coming back from working at the school. I was working for the community in Herndon, you know, right back into the community organizations. And I was also working and trying to set up an alumni association for MPA. And so like, even though I was like still hooked in because they were like, you know, economic opportunities that I needed. And but I was really like just I was really hard time. I was going through so much. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
so going through all kinds of obstacles and challenges that were presenting themselves to us being together that were like very challenging. There was, you know, coming back from working at the school in India, being back in my childhood home for the first time for more than a few months at a time since I was like 11. And so it was very tumultuous emotionally and like financially. I was like, you know, they paid me next to nothing in India. I basically maxed out my credit cards living there just to like be able to enjoy myself, like go on a little trip, or certainly wasn't living large. But they paid so little that I just, you know, I didn't have any money. So I came back less than penniless, like in total debt, and trying to dig myself out. And Sick Money and I end up together, and then circumstances make it so that she can't come to the United States. And I figure out, you know, I'm working for this alumni association part-time online, and we decide to elope to Mexico, and we ended up getting married in Mexico in a little civil ceremony. And then began our green card process, which brought me to go live with her in England. And we were there, and then after about a year of living abroad and just sort of like figuring out how to be together, she finally was able to come to the States, and that's 2017 when she lands, which is also shortly thereafter, months thereafter, when Gur Amrit sells the house out from, and Onkar sell the house out from under us. So I was like, we were in total, like, after leaving India until about 2018, so like a good 6 years, I feel like I was like in chaos in some ways, worried about my parents, ability, like housing situation, income and health, and dealing with, this whole unfolding of my relationship with money that is requiring us to improvise and live around the world and scrape together an income. And then I settle back down in Virginia, and they sell the house out from under us. And incidentally, this is also when I start to become politically aware. The Bernie Sanders campaign happens in 2016. And I listen to him talk and I go, this is the only politician that has ever said anything that made any sense to me, that people should have health care as a human right, that people should have housing as a human right, that you should have education as a human right, that you should have a clean environment as a human right, that, and an understanding that essentially the story of America and the story of history is who controls the means of production, who controls how we make what we make, and who is able to accumulate wealth is who controls political power, and the social ills of the world are the side effects of a sick way of doing business as a society that divides people according to their skin color and their sexual orientation, their gender, their country of origin. It basically to keep us from wrestling power from the very few people who have vast amounts of, the vast majority of wealth in all of society. And this isn't conspiratorial thinking. This is just the basic economics and reality of the world we live in.
Yep.
It made sense to me that if capitalism and the way that we govern society, and the system that not only allows but encourages the vast accumulation of wealth and the domination by a few over the many, if that's how we do things, then it makes sense to me to be a socialist, to fight against that system and to work to build a different system, because the system's bad. And it basically runs off of violence and exploitation that gets papered over by entertainment and material distraction. And I recognized some congruencies between what I was seeing in America and what Bernie was saying and what was going on in my own community, and how my own community was not living up to and never had lived according to any kind of values that were anything but American capitalism with a turban on.
Yes.
And that capitalism brings along with it white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia, etc. So when people talk about 3HO as like a white supremacist organization, it's not saying that this is the Ku Klux Klan. These weren't overtly racist, atavistic, violent, white supremacists. These were people who were educated in and molded in the America that they were molded in, which was inherently and is inherently white supremacist. It's how we built the wealth of this country. And it's how we divided the rest of the world along colonial lines and post-colonial lines, and continued neo-colonial relationships with the darker countries of this world.
Yes.
And we maintained that mentality. We never had any deep questioning of it. We never had an alternative. We just had somebody who basically taught and lived by the same mentality, but used really interesting language and a whole mythology to just, make his own little brand of it that created a different enough experience for the employees where
Yeah, so well said. There's so much that you just said. I hope you all go back and rewind that whole little segment, because the pillars of white supremacy that we oftentimes don't recognize, and one of the main ones that I've been able to recognize in the 3HO culture, besides a bazillion other things, was the exceptionalism. When you have such an exceptional story that allows you to be the exception to white supremacy, there is the indicator that you're so deeply steeped in it.
right. Well, and it's interesting to learn from Premka's book that Yogi Bhajan instructed her to write letters that were published in Punjabi newspapers. Mind you, Premka didn't read or write Punjabi, so they had to be translated. He had her write letters about how we're like the true inheritors of, the Sikh tradition, that Punjabi children are cutting their hair and drinking and leaving the community, and we're the real continuation of the Khalsa tradition and all this kind of stuff. It makes perfect sense to me that he would have directed her to do that, and that he would have promoted that feeling for a few reasons. One is because he himself was wealthy and relatively light-skinned and privileged and educated and benefited from the meritocracy. And also, it created a useful firewall, so that people couldn't go hear the perspective of the Punjabi community or understand it.
Mm, mm. Yeah, the legitimization of ourselves through that type of a maneuver. Yeah. You also talked about social capital and how important that is in terms of the posture and positioning that somebody like a Jagat Guru has even to this day. I witnessing him branding himself as a spiritual coach, and this social capital is
Yeah.
everything.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in this world, financial capital is super important, obviously. And you can see that in who was elevated and who was sort of brought into the inner circle and what kinds of experiences they had in 3HO. But social capital was super important in the community, but also like even all the way down to the school level. Like I alluded to, if you were Jagagu's friend and you were a boy and you played basketball and had the same kind of humor and I think, and this is when I was there as a kid, and I think I saw similar behavior when I was there as a teacher as well. And everyone evolves and grows, and so I want to like respect the fact that Jagat Guru has been dealt the cards that he's been dealt in this world, and um, have just like an understanding of that, and not sit here and try to like cast judgment, because that's just not, I don't know, I just don't see myself or whatever anybody as higher or lower. I think we're all just going on this, we've been dealt the cards we have.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
say that though to say that I saw social capital in action at school in India, and I understood that if you wanted to be treated a certain way, you presented yourself in a certain way. A lot of these guys that sort of enjoyed this special attention, they'd also they'd be like really active in the yoga class, or they'd be doing their own meditations, and they'd be a part of the Gutka, the voluntary Gutka team.
But how about
And
the
it,
Ragi group? Like if you were a part of the Ragi group, I mean, that only adds to the social capital. So even beyond focusing on Jagat Guru and how that played out in his life or Guru Devkar's life, thinking about the social capital as a norm of 3HO, as a wielding of power that YB instilled early on. Premka got social capital. She was one of the least, she was so deprived, as her memoir talks about, and yet the posturing she got enabled her to have a position that other people were violated by. Even if it wasn't her being the violator, the position itself was the social capital that created hierarchies in which other people's lives were doomed or uplifted. And so I see this as a thread around how I think how the denier side, the people that are completely not paying attention, and all the people that are playing shocked and genuinely from their heart may genuinely be shocked because maybe they were in a blind stupor for the last 45 years, which we know in complex trauma is very plausible and very possible. And then you add yoga and meditation and Sikhi to it, and it's even that much easier to stay in this kind of zone of not paying attention. So going back to social capital, YB yielded and wielded social capital by who he gave attention to, by who he positioned, by who he gave names and titles to. And even if they weren't actually making money, the social positioning bought them enough capital until they had to move on to something else, until his attention no longer was on them. So I just felt like the whole languaging you gave that, not directed specifically to MPA, although that has a whole generation of what you talked about. There were decades of people decrying change. There were decades of people speaking to things needed changing. This, I think, goes back to social capital, that the people doing that decrying weren't important enough to actually be able to be on the inside to where those changes could happen. Like that's the nature of that, this institutional abuse you keep referring to, that it's not just about a well-meaning person wanting change.
Right. And if you were on the inside, you wouldn't have those views. You wouldn't have a critical view. You wouldn't be allowed inside. You know, it's like people talk about politicians and God, I can't, why do they do this? Why do they vote for things? Why do they vote for, Wall Street or pharmaceutical companies or weakening labor unions? Like, even if you're ostensibly like a Democrat or on the left. And it's like, well, they wouldn't be in that position in the first place if they had the view that unions should be strengthened and that people deserve universal health care. They wouldn't be there in the first place, like Obama is allowed to be our first Black president, even though there are other Black politicians, before and along with him who were brilliant organizers and orators and had fantastic ideas for policy. They were never going to be there. They were never going to get there because their point of view is too critical and radical. And so you need somebody who's going to be acceptable and palatable. So,
yes, it's like holding the party line, right? It's that kind of concept. And even as we've witnessed from the book Premka and Pamela's story, but other people's stories that have, quote, been in leadership positions, a part of the wielding of social capital is that he never really gave power. So social capital kind of has the illusion of power. Somebody could be in a position of power and actually have no power at all. And they are more powerless because he postured them publicly and then he isolates them and doesn't allow them to have self. And so it's one thing I don't think, I think that there's a complexity to layers of inner circles, people in power, people that were, because when you actually end up in leadership positions in some of these places of institutional abuse, you realize you never have any capacity to wield anything. You feel more trapped and then more duplicitous, like what you're talking about, realizing I can't change anything. Where should I go? My whole identity's here. And so decades can go by in that place until you have a situation that pulls your ass out of it and just says done already.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that social capital is so powerful when Yogi Bhajan's alive because it's all about proximity to Yogi Bhajan, and losing that proximity is the same thing as losing the power. If you could be Letty Singh or whoever at the top of the food chain and then be out, all of a sudden because you're going through Shaktipat and you're negative or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
And it's just, it was no different in my era. It's like you had it's funny, it wasn't any one factor that kind of gave you social capital, because there were people who went to school in India who adopted the Nihang, Damala style, and they got into kirtan, but they didn't get the kind of like love or the um, sort of elevation that, say, Sarasat and Jagat Guru and Chardi Kala Jetha did.
Mm.
And multiple reasons for that. I mean, it's their existing position in the community. It's also the fact that, like, Jagat Guru was placed in India where he could learn and practice, and Sarasat, had the means to be able to study and live in India without having to make money for a long period of time. And that's an interesting story too, that his family obviously come from wealth and have a certain position in the community and all of that. And again, it's just like, I'm just pointing out like realities. Like I consider Sarasat like a friend, and I think he's like a good guy, like a with I don't know. I just think he's a good guy who means well, but it's like it's that doesn't really matter. It's like, and I'm not talking about him now, because now I feel like is a very different story, and I don't feel like I can even evaluate anything or pass any kind of judgment. Again, looking back at that time and going, it wasn't just if you did the yoga. It wasn't just if you had the identity. It wasn't just if you spoke good Punjabi. Because there was a lot of people that learned a lot and had a lot to offer that went through the schools and that whole world, that didn't get that same sort of elevation of status. And I think there's multiple factors of who is in that group and what their kind of roles are in the community as is, and who their families are.
Who their families are. I wanted to bring that up. Who their parents are. If I'm understanding, and I wanted to go back to this anyway, around the East Coast, a lot of people in Virginia had come from prominence, wealth, and you had brought that up earlier. But specifically, I believe it's Guru Sangat,
Yeah.
Sangankar, and their family lineage is actually the CIA guy. What was his name?
James Angleton.
James Angleton. So I wanted to bring this up because it just adds to the complexity of the history of certain families that ended up in social capital roles. So of course, YB had a masterful ability to pull people in that had wealth, to find out who had wealth, to bring them as close to him as possible until he could extract that wealth. And not just from the people who joined, but also from their brothers and sisters who may or may not have joined. I know my mother alone had her brothers that came in briefly and got extracted with money. Anyway, this is not new. This isn't unique to, as you said, Sarasat or any of it, but who your family is and what position that family held in the proximity of YB, and how much social capital carried on even beyond YB's death and still exists to this day. That for years, even prior to 2020, people would tell stories about how close they were to YB. Teacher trainers would speak about being an original teacher. They were marketing the olden day teachers as the legacy teachers. Everything was always about the proximity, closeness, and influence of YB. Even over the last decade of watching the white tantric yogas, every story that every beautiful young woman tantric facilitator that are my sisters, and I love them personally, so this isn't against any of y'all personally, but you all held the party line of telling your nostalgic stories of the ways in which YB influenced you in interestingly personal ways. And this adds to social capital. Until then, in 2020, then it became less social capital to be as close to YB. And so you saw people rebranding their story to have it being influenced by more than YB and all these things, which adds again to the complexity. It's like, it's not Jagat Guru's cards. He didn't deal himself those cards. Either did Sarasat Singh, either did Guru Dev Kar, either did me, you, the household we come in, the caste we end up in, the class we end up in, how important our family was to the social order and how much they carried that party line. Like my dad was known as being a troublemaker. So even though he held the party line, he often created chaos. And so this becomes the persona of him and then what his kids quote got. To pull this
Right.
stuff apart doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. But YB did these things manipulatively because then you think you're forming bonds with your neighbor, but really there's a deeply bred competition for status as a household.
Yeah, and if there's not a competition, it's because people understand their own status and they accept it. So it may not necessarily be there is competition, certain types, but then there's folks that accept their position. I mean, I think that my dad,
So
you
well
know, I
said.
like saw him seize Gurjot Singh as sort of the closest thing that he still has to kind of like a teacher or like a mentor or something like that.
Yeah.
And like, and that was the case way back then too. And like, I can't read my dad's mind, but just from a life kind of observing, you kind of can see how like who looks up to who and sort of who envies who or who listens to who and
Yeah.
who perceives themselves and how people perceive themselves in relation to each other. And there was a hierarchy, but a lot of that hierarchy, yes, it was like around that proximity to Yogi Bhajan, but then it also was related to the existing hierarchies that are built into society, like you're talking about, of generational wealth and, your blood, all of that kind of stuff. So, it was just another filter through which it was passing, and obscured once again. The true relationship is obscured once again. And I think like, you know, so like, I guess I'll go back a little bit and just kind of just to get through the narrative, I think, and refocus. Like, 2017, 2018 is a big change. The house gets sold out from under us. By the same token that our neighbor across the street sells our house out from under us, our neighbors next door, Satwant Singh and Gurjot Kaur, basically delay. They were planning on selling their own home. They delay selling it so that we can basically live there and pay, cover their costs or whatever on, at the drop of a hat. And they wanted to make sure that we could stay in the neighborhood and all of that. And people in the community were upset and wanted to figure out a way to help. So it wasn't like black and white. Like on one hand, on one hand, it's like there's this gross betrayal of not only like your neighbor and friend, but just sort of the mentality that you're supposed to think you think you're supposed to be upholding on the part of Onkar and Amrit. And at the same time, there was a lot of empathy and concern on the part of other people in the community. So it's not like it was, again, it's more complex than being one thing.
Yep.
It did definitely make me think like, the problems that we have are happening because, we only conceived of how to live in this world under the terms that kind of everybody else does. We didn't think of anything different. We didn't think of any way to like ensure each other's, well-being. We just sort of were middle class liberals that, owned our homes and had our jobs and went to church on Sunday. Except it was a Gurdwara. And nobody's free from that. I think that people, that's the norm, is my point. It's not like, it's hard to rise above it because it's such a powerful system. And we are really kind of left to our own, all ourselves to sort of scramble through this world. So you really have.
I want to have you put a pin there because I want you to finish the thought, but I do have a question for you on that because I feel like there was an entire generation that did think they were doing something different than the capitalistic norm. They were living communally. This is what they thought, why they should give the businesses up to the family business. They thought that what they were doing was different. What they didn't realize is that he was a tyrannical leader taking it for himself, and he wasn't leaving anything for a family of anything. So there was that. But I also feel like the East Coast did it differently in that a lot of people did have their homes under their own names, where, say, in Phoenix, that was not the case at all. Every single property was under 3HO Phoenix. Nobody, and my dad talked about it through my childhood as a strategy to get beyond capitalism so that you didn't have to pay taxes on land and yada yada if there was a mission-based life. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there because I think some people thought they were doing something different.
Definitely. And so it's, again, I mean, my assessment of things is imperfect because it's like you can't factor for all these complexities, but the point, I guess, is that we even, well, it's the point that you made, which is that at the top of it all was a self-interested person, and structurally it had no democratic mechanisms, so it was a dictatorship. So they put all their trust that, yeah, they did have this vision, an egalitarian kind of a vision that is so admirable and is so like beautiful, and unfortunately it was taken advantage of by this person, and they rescinded their own power to him, and they didn't have like a political or organizational project that would ensure the accountability and democratic kind of, the democratic accountability that's required to maintain actual egalitarianism. Like, you need to actually have systems in place and power structures that are responsive to people, but you obviously didn't have that. So I guess my kind of realization, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think the point that I feel sometimes can be lost in these conversations, because of the cult label, which I have no problem with as an academic or a psychological tool for sort of understanding, for grouping studies and understanding phenomena. But something that I think can also happen is a hyperfixation on the cult aspect and losing sight of the fact, like the reality that all of these systems of violence and hierarchy and control are existing concurrently with what we're experiencing in 3HO. You want to talk about lack of accountability in a tyrannical power system, like talk to, poor people in America, poor Black people in America in particular, but poor people, period. So like every bit of their lives is controlled and mitigated by factors outside of their control. And many of them still sort of believe in the myth. I mean, you have a lot of people who are still caught up by racism and hatred as an explanation for their troubles, and still have faith in some sort of an American ideal and a myth that allows them to continue participating in a system of violence and right. Supporting and promoting it, even when it's completely counter to their interests.
Mm-hmm. You're talking dominator systems, right? Imperialism, neocolonialism, like how all this, I feel like I got there after doing maybe like 50 interviews, and I started realizing, wow, okay, we're nothing special, actually, folks. Like, this is just a little microcosm of all these systems that, as you start to see it, and you can start to see dominator systems. But for me, that happened by having these interviews and realizing, whoa, this cultural other identity that I've so shaped my whole self around is rooted in the legacies of white supremacy, or in the myth of white supremacy. but it's a really hard reality to see in yourself. Like, whoa, I participate in this because I don't know how to speak to it, because I'm silent to it. Um, I say I stand for something else, but I don't know how to, because my identity is so wrapped in that. So I really appreciate you lending that to this conversation. It's so easy to think we have all these things we need to talk about in 3HO. And we do. Of course we do. We need to air out our dark laundry. And you start seeing the whole world and you realize, wow, we got lots more work to do.
And the conclusion that I come to is from that realization is the need for solidarity with the downtrodden, basically, and like to position yourself as adversarial to the systems that perpetuate what we're talking about.
System of
And
harm.
it's hard because as an individual, you don't have any power. And ultimately, the only power that we can build is the power of solidarity and togetherness and large numbers that build their movement in the image that they want to govern from. So you build your own internal structures such that you're accountable to each other, and that you're not allowing for dictatorship and manipulation, and you work together to intervene where you can in this broader society against these systems that keep us impoverished, ignorant, violated, and that for those of us who don't live that way, who don't feel violated, who don't feel under threat, who have means, it's important to recognize that your plot in life is inextricable from all of those people in suffering and without means, and that ultimately we don't fucking fix this stuff, climate change is going to drown us all anyway. And so it's like the story of 3HO is actually an extremely timely and important story that all of us who experienced, I hope, can come to a conclusion of the need for organization and collaboration and solidarity with oppressed peoples of all stripes, and to put whatever you can on the line to fight against that. And that's like, to me, that's the only conclusion, is like wherever you're at inside of 3HO, participate in the political stuff, do what you can to share the message, like what you're doing, of telling the story, of putting a counter narrative and message out there. Outside of 3HO, read history, like understand how we've arrived at like this moment of crisis, and that it's all connected to the way that the way that our systems are structured to operate. It's not individuals, it's not political parties, it's not certain countries, it's not certain religions. It is the very way that we just do business as a society that incentivizes the worst and suppresses the best of us. And it's no different. And so like, yeah, it's not to simplify, to oversimplify either of them, but it's to say like let's not lose sight of the bigger question, and I think that the real root of these problems.
100%. And the bigger responsibility we carry to actually notice this outside of the microcosm of this unique identity we got, and fighting against that wow, the awareness or the lack of awareness thereof within the structures we come from, and start seeing institutionalized abuse the way that it's all around us, even if we're the privileged recipients of that.
Exactly.
It's mind blowing for me, the healing I've received in this arena in the last year, by being willing to examine these unexamined parts of me because of the unique cultural experience we got. Um, And haven't been politically active as you are. I really appreciate your lens into this, through the work that you do, what you stand for, and just the work you're doing on yourself, to make sense of unsensible things. um, I want to also just acknowledge what you shared about Sukhmani and your journey together and the immigration story of that. And I didn't know the connection. I didn't know she was the singer, with Snatam and Ajit, even though I have listened to both of those works and all the things. So it makes me happy to realize, oh, that's the Sukhmani.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for this. I know we skipped over your entire Eugene experience, and not sure if you want to mention anything from those years, or anything specific that you haven't covered that you want to make sure you cover in this episode.
I mean, I experienced a lot of important things, I think, in Oregon. I think that, I still have relationships with people from the community there. Um, really good people out there who are a little older than me, but also grew up in the community. And um, they were really important in helping me sort of navigate that time after India. And so I'm definitely like, the majority of feelings that I have about Oregon are really positive ones. I went to college out there, and um, had my first love and had my education, and kind of, it was really sort of the first time I was opening myself up to, well, really living among people that weren't 3HO, frankly. And that was huge. And that's also where I got, I would say, introduced to like grassroots politics. And uh, that's where that's where I met the first anarchists and socialists and radicals I ever met. And I didn't know it, but they were all leaving an impression on me. I saw Occupy Wall Street happen from Eugene. I participated in Occupy marches. And again, I wasn't connecting what I was doing to a bigger political vision or project, but they were all little awakening moments that were really important. And yeah, it was an important place and time, and I'm grateful for it. And it definitely was important for sort of helping me open up and transition in my life. So I love Oregon.
Awesome. And I think it's an important ashram to bring up because it's, the hub of Yogi Tea, and there's just so many young people that do congregate in certain areas during what I consider like the no man's land zones, like after India, not sure what's next. And so many of us had these transitions periods around like, what did we do? And you end up congregating in certain types of ashrams that then lead to other opportunities. So I just wanted to open that space in case there was more of that.
No, yeah, I mean, it's good that you mentioned. I mean, it's like I was actually in the courtroom when because I was in Oregon, and where the court proceedings took place for the whole unto infinity thing.
Damn.
So I was like, I was working at Golden Temple and Yogi Tea like when all of this stuff started happening. I was there when they sold the cereal part.
What year?
It would have been like around 20, I think I'm right if I'm saying like 2010, 2011, when all of this starts unfolding. I remember seeing Kartar get questioned on the stand, and what's her name? Was it Prem? And all these people that were like the Unto Infinity board. I watched that all sort of unfold. That was interesting. That was a real interesting moment to be like, these people are like maybe justifiably angry at 3HO, but their response is to just steal everything for themselves, basically, like to just massively enrich. And so, like, at the time, I was against them, and I was very critical. I was like, these guys are obviously doing something self-serving, and this was not right. But it was definitely an interesting time that I don't think, yeah, it was like the beginning of like this political turmoil that is continuing now. I think like it just, because the myth was still so strong, there was allowed to be this sort of like unity and like kind of sense of like us versus these bad guys. It was kind of interesting to see. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a kind of split in the community somewhat, because some people's parents got involved with that whole Sikh Dharma stewardship board, and then there's those kind of lines start to get drawn. And then it was very interesting to see then how those rifts then re-rift after Yogi Bhajan, all this stuff comes out, and who ends up where. And I don't know, that was definitely fascinating to watch. And you definitely felt like a sense of decline and a sense of like whatever project was intended is not going.
It's not going to according to a plan, because the people that were left in positions of leadership, they leave, take the money, and take off their turbans. Like that's the response, like I was so far out of the community, Shabad, but I remember thinking to myself, because I was around Krishna at the time, thinking to myself, like, is that not symbolic or what? Like these people that hold down leadership all these years, as soon as they get a chance, they take off their turban and run.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But watching the factions, yeah, totally interesting. Thank you for that insight too. I thought that was really, really interesting. And lastly, one thing that's on my mind is, I know you were a part of the Vice documentary that came out, and I'm just wondering how that felt. And there weren't that many of us as second gen speaking there. Um, but I thought your lens was an important lens, and you added a voice that I hadn't heard other voices come in and speak to. And so I was just overall wondering how that felt.
Well, the producer reached out to me through I became friends with Philip DeSlip, the professor,
Yep.
and some really interesting research on Yogi Bhajan's history and history of the community. And um, him and I actually had a conversation in 2018 where he told me about, he didn't use Premka's name, or I think he alluded to Premka and that story, but then said there's just so much more, where, women all have the same or similar stories. None of them knew each other at the time until later. And so as early as 2018, I was having this sort of political transformation. The house gets sold out from under us. And um, I'm developing this kind of new political criticism of the community, and seeing how like power is vested and used in the community, and how, what we've been talking about, how it runs along the same lines as broader society. And I go, man, this is really messed up. And I was being very critical of it online and getting into all kinds of fiery debates on the second gen page or whatever. And, uh, and and then Philip and I started talking. I just stumbled onto his work somewhere, and I thought it was interesting, because I was like, he's obviously has done serious research, and this isn't just somebody like making a personalized criticism or something like that. This is somebody who's really like researching and interviewing and all that. So it was interesting to me, but the defense mechanisms were still so
Tact.
strong that I was immediately like uh, weary of him, you know. So I talked to him on the phone, and I just had like a nice, friendly conversation with him. And somehow we got to talking about the stories of abuse, and he brought up, what I just said about multiple women and all similar stories. And that planted a seed in me where I was like, and once I heard that and we finished that conversation, and I thought about that possibility in the broader configuration of everything that I was realizing, I was like, oh no, that makes perfect sense. Of course, that makes absolute perfect sense to me. And then it also wasn't the first time I'd heard anything. I'd heard things from Punjabi friends. I'd heard things just, or you start to look back at stories you hear and then you see them in a different light, about, the secretaries and all this kind of stuff. Like you just kind of go, oh, he was surrounded by a house full of women, of young women all the time who waited on hand and foot. Yeah, okay. Like it, I was like, well, if that there, the means and the circumstances, the power, the motivation, I mean, it's all there, so it makes sense. So that was kind of, I was sort of not shocked when all the Premka stuff started to come out, but that was obviously really important for just getting everybody like talking about it and having some kind of a common reference point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the Zoom calls, I think what shocked me the most, and probably many, was suddenly hearing all the second gens start talking about their India stories. And from your own experience, obviously people knew that there were things going on in India, but nobody was ever talking about it in some sort of a public way. Um,
Yeah.
and so that in of itself is in our community can be shocking, because when things are hidden or just not discussed and then they're discussed, it can produce all sorts of animated emotions inside.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that call you're referencing, was supposed to be like a call that was a few hours. It ended up being 11 hours on Zoom of just like crushing story after crushing story of abuse and mistreatment, and at the schools and by or with Yogi Bud. And I was going through that. I was experiencing that at the same time that Philip put me in touch with the producer for the Vice documentary.
Wow.
And, I really, this point that I kind of keep harping on of this similarity, the congruencies between what we experience in the broader world was really at top of mind. And, it's just, I just think it's just not a perspective that, or a point of view or like an idea that others were really expressing. And I just felt like it was really important to bring up, because I feel like the actual solution to these kinds of problems is a political one. It's a question of power. And I really didn't want that to get lost, because it's not just about like sentiments, and it's not just about like a desire for things to be better. It's about doing them differently.
Mm.
So I really wanted that sort of narrative to at least be considered by folks and to be more widely considered in general. And so when the producer reached out to me, we ended up on like a several hour long call where I was kind of laying out my own story, but also like the analysis that I'm sharing. And he found it really compelling. And, originally was, because of those conversations, was pushing to try and make a whole series about it, which unfortunately got scrapped and it got put into one episode. And so the little bit that you see of me in there is like clipped out of probably an hour plus of film. And the way I felt about participating in it was overall was good, because I felt that the producer from Vice was coming at it with a really genuine, do no harm kind of perspective of, okay, I want to focus on the stories of the survivors, and I don't want to like paint some salacious, sensational picture of, look at these rubes who got taken in by this, wacky guy from India. I was really concerned about that. And I found him to be the opposite of that. He'd worked in Palestine covering that conflict on the side of the Palestinians living in Gaza. So I was like, okay, this guy is not an asshole, if he's going to put his body on the line that way for in that circumstance. And so I agreed to do it, and I tried to get some other folks. I actually, I think that I was, in part helped Sat Pavan participate. encouraged her to participate, and but obviously it was her courage, and I mean, what an incredible uh, thing to capture. I thought that was obviously the most moving and important part of the whole documentary. I'd say the criticisms that I have is that, the counterpoint, the sort of believer, is represented by Gurfateh Singh, coincidentally Himit's dad. That's who Himit's mother left.
Know that.
Too small of a word. He was sort of the main, him and Dharma Singh, who are two, if you wanted to present
the most fanatical view, right?
And if you wanted to, obviously you would have liked the people who are still in from first gen, who have accepted the truth, didn't get any kind of voice in that. So it's sort of painted like the people who leave are the sane ones and the people who stay are the crazy ones. And they look at, the sane ones, they were right all along and they were saying blah, blah, blah. And then here's the crazy ones. And then you don't have like
the nuance,
or yeah, all the good people that we know who are still wearing their turbans and participating in the community, but who are like fighting to make sure that, survivors that victims get money, and that whatever the community can do to actually support them happens. Like, those people exist. So that was a really important piece that got lost in the sauce. And I don't think it was nefarious. I think it's just the nature of
a 30-minute segment, right?
So he called me, apologized. He said that Vice basically decided not to make it a series. So.
Got it. Well, I just want to thank you for your participation. Obviously, Sat Pavan and all the rest that did too. But I do think it's incredibly courageous when anybody that's born in to our community speaks out in this capacity, especially with a dissenting opinion, and I say dissenting, but just one that's steadfast in the discovery of yourself over the high demands that our lives absolutely incurred. And when you grow up in something, it's normal. So all of us are just kind of used to high demands. I didn't even know there was such thing as a high demand group. And personally, I think it's a better name than cult, because it's high controlled group or high demand group. To me, made me realize, oh yeah, there were definitely lots of demands on our life. And I've never looked at it as demands or controlling, except that it all was, so I appreciate that lens as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making a space for people to talk about all this stuff.
I do have one last question for you, because I have experienced it, and I'm just kind of wondering how you would handle it being more politically active. So one of the things I had remembered Krishna Kaur mentioning, and she's just like in full spiritual bypass. I know she means well. She cares about the kids. She cares about everybody. She wants everybody to get along. But my experience in dealing with her, she's 80 something, is she basically becomes a child when I talk to her about anything related to this community or Yogi Bhajan or abuse. And I see that as a trauma response. It's not something I would tell her, like, you're turning into a child, because that's, it's self-defeating, and it doesn't help move the conversation. But now that I recognize complex trauma in myself, and I can recognize it in general, we all have different expressions of it. It can come out in various random ways. So one of the things she would say, and I knew it was a bypass, but still it's making a good point. And the point is, well, the government's a cult. Well, the whole world is set up capitalistically in a way that, and so making the points you're making, but it's a bypass. So there's a difference between what I feel and experience with you having this conversation around, we really need to look at dominator systems and the way this type of stuff plays out on much larger political schematas, and not using that as the reason to not self-examine and to look at our own community.
Right. No, I mean, that's a good point. On that 11-hour call, somebody who was not born into the community, but who joined it later, thought that it'd be a good idea to talk about their experience of going to Catholic boarding school as a sort of a way to say bad shit happens everywhere. Why are we like hyper focusing on this? Why are we blah, 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 right? Which is, and I exploded on the call. I came off of mute. I couldn't contain myself. And I honestly kind of regret it, because I don't think that this person is an ill-meaning person. I think that that's genuinely what they thought, and I disagree with them, but it was just so charged that I like exploded, and I was just like, not the read the room, kind of a situation. And I owe her a call, actually. I should probably give her a call. But anyway, so that is an important distinction, because similarly to like the way Donald Trump says, like, oh, when people would talk about horrible things that, like, there's a famous clip, right, where somebody's like criticizing Putin or something, is years ago, and he goes, oh, you think America's full of sweethearts and angels? Like, we got, cold killers. Like, that's how we built our world. And it's like, it's sort of the like, again, it's bypassing by saying like, oh, this is just the way the world works and blah blah blah. And he was actually really good at that, and it was one of his tools, his mechanisms for moving the conversation to where he wanted it. Really masterful. Actually, I'm at the risk of sounding like I'm going to praise Donald Trump, which, obviously I vehemently oppose his politics. I hope that he goes to prison, but you can't deny how slick he was in a certain way, psychologically, the way that he played off of people. But anyway, that's an aside. So yes, it can be a total bypass to say, hey, the world's fucked up, that's how things are, live in reality, live in the reality that we live in, like, get real, you're being unserious, this is pie in the sky thinking, like, this has been a problem since forever. Okay, well, guess what? Until the labor movement basically shut down industry at the turn of the 20th century, we didn't have weekends or an 8-hour workday. And now we do, because people intervened and acted. It's as simple as that. It's okay, yeah, the world is fucked up. We all agree on that. Yeah, the systems of control are messed up and we don't like them. Okay, we can all agree on that. But then what do you do with that information? Okay, is it, oh, everything is a conspiracy, right? Everything is, oh, it's the Jews. Oh, it's it's because of immigrants. Oh, it's because of 5G. Oh, it's because of whatever. Insert, fantasy here to neatly explain why your life isn't going the way that you want it to, instead of dealing with the reality of very real, identifiable things happening right in front of us that are immiserating our lives and our planet and our ecology. Now, what are you going to do with that information? And what is the correct response? And when you understand, like, what is actually going on, and it's simple. It is an age-old story of rich and poor, and have not, and power and control. And the response that everybody has to changing capitalism is they go, well, what about the Soviet Union, and what about the demagoguery of that, and all this kind of stuff? And it's like, okay, well, what can we learn from that, guys? Obviously, if that didn't work the way we wanted it to, what can we take from that worked? What can we take from capitalism that worked? What can we take from liberalism that worked? What can we take from socialism? And we have to build something, and we also have to fight, and we have to win power to figure out what we actually even want to do. And so it's very much the opposite of, yeah, things are bad and everywhere is bad. It's like, no, if everybody standing in the world right now could suddenly have a class consciousness and a political awareness, be and recognize the contours of the domination of their lives, and they said simultaneously, I'm going to now act in this way because of what's going on to me, to respond to it, then things can change. And they have changed, like we have changed things before. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just think it's such an important remembrance that we all take as listeners to be like, that's not a good response back, right? We can't take you can't just put a turban on the same behavior, call yourself a spiritual community and think it's all better, because it's just putting plaster over the same mechanisms of control and domination, and now is using spiritual lingo. And as Philip de Slip so eloquently described in his academic research, pulling the real story of where all this came from. What made YB such a good leader is that he was stealing real truths, and then he gave us a totally unique identity with a bunch of fragmented truth. So our whole identity is quite a lie. It doesn't, but if you trace it back to the truth, you can find yourself, so to speak. Kind of same
That's
thing.
so important too to say, because I also try to always, whenever I'm talking to like people from the first gen, it's like I know that I speak with like a certain like percussiveness or whatever. Like I know that I can be very plain spoken and direct and appear to be like maybe have some acerbicness to how I speak, and it might come across as like angry or I don't like you, or I don't like this, or this is bad. And that's really not how I approach any of this stuff, because I try to see it systemically, and I try to remove the individual's sole responsibility. Of course, we have to have responsibility and accountability in life, but in terms of diagnosing the problem and the solution, if you just focus on individual personalities, you're going to miss what's happening. I always like that's how I see things. And I always try to say, like, I respect and admire what that generation did. I respect and admire the people that got into 3HO, whether they were in it for 2 years or 40, whether they do see the truth or they don't, because they forged ahead in something that they really believed in. They worked their asses off. The majority of them were honest people. They built this. Yogi Bhajan didn't do shit. He just happened to be the spoke around everything was turning. This belongs to the people that built it, but unfortunately, they can't even recognize that themselves. But I actually have a load of respect for all of them and love and admiration. And I don't think that they have to. Nobody wants you to throw your identity and your history down the toilet and say, oh, like that's not how I see it. I'm not shitting on these people, because I think that we know what we know when we know it. We do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have. And we now have some new knowledge. So let's actually do the best that we can. That's all anybody is saying. We're not saying we hate you, or you're horrible, or you are the cause of this pain. It's like, no, we are all part of this story. We now got some new info. Let's please move forward together based on that. And, that's how I wish it would go, but.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing that here, for bringing your story, for bringing your heart, and also just for bringing it to the world. I just really appreciate you. Thank you.
Wes, thank you.
We're going to move into wrapping up, and tell us about the song you chose, and also make sure you say anything else that you want to share to listeners before we wrap up.
Just, I don't know, do what makes you feel really alive, and explore your creativity and your mind and your curiosity. And that's the only thing that's helped me through all of this, because I've been through a lot of pain. I'm still dealing with psychological issues. You talked about returning to childhood. When my wife brings up that I didn't take out the trash, I sometimes can't even deal with it, because I'm back in, she's laughing, because I go back to being scolded for, I don't know, being forced into the cold shower at 3 a.m. when I'm 4, because it's the right thing to do, or whatever, when I'm just trying to deal with reality, and somebody's trying to show me some new information and asking me to act a little bit differently based on that. I have a hard time dealing with it. So the only way that I've found healing is therapy. I do see a somatic therapist. I don't see a cult specific therapist, but I found that, and I think that that's a good idea, but just not my case. That's been profoundly helpful. I take venlafaxine XR, which is an antidepressant. That helps a lot, and I also just try to stay engaged with like my own mind and my own creativity, and that's really helped. So if any of that can be helpful to folks out there, I hope it can be.
I appreciate your vulnerability, even in our exchange, your willingness to be like, yeah, I'm feeling depression and I don't think it's a good time to talk. And the process of being able to come home to our own emotional experience and be able to name what something is, I found to be extremely hard over the decades. So your willingness to share that, I just had so much respect. I know it's a daily struggle. I really suffer daily with complications of CPTSD, and a lot of it is moving from hyper anxiousness that I would have never called anxiety because we weren't allowed to have an identity of anything that was emotionally unregulated. Um, so even though all the symptoms were obviously anxious, I would have never put it in that category, which is totally weird to me today. But not at
Yeah.
all once we understand our experience. Same thing with depression. Of course, I had experienced depression. I just would have never called it such a thing. So, again, your vulnerability to share yourself, and also whether it's medication, whether it's therapy, whatever realm of therapy we find. I've learned also that we can need different types of therapy at different stages of ourself. And so, wherever you find yourself, I just, I have so much honor for you for knowing what's right for you, but also any one of us, the place you land, get the support you need and know that it can evolve and change.
Yeah, and it's out there and it helps.
Absolutely. What I've recently found more recently is cult support groups through the Lawlich Center. It's not therapy and it's not even set up it that way, but it is an opportunity to be able to just join in group discussions where there's other people of born and raised groups as well as people who joined. And what's blown my mind so much about it is to realize how many versions, like we had this unique exceptional wear a turban identity, but so many more of them are not. I found there could be a political cults, there were lots of psycho development, brain development, a lot of other kind of new age cults.
I,
And anyway, it's blowing my mind because when you meet other people that have also gone through things like you see the similarities in each other, and it has nothing to do with the same ideology.
yeah, yeah, we're all Pokemon
Right.
noises, but we all went back into the same Pokeball.
We make different noises. Fantastic. Thank you for your sharing, transparency, and sharing with us in process. I only have good memories of being in your household, and I do also remember it being weird in the sense that I felt like I wasn't a part of 3HO anymore. I was forming this new identity. I didn't have respect for YB. And I remember Guru Jot Singh suggesting, I had dreadlocks at the time, and Guru Jot Singh was like, "Would you like to call YB and find out his opinion on dreadlocks?" And I was like, "No, actually, thanks." So, like, I was in such a rebel spirit stage of living in your guys' ashram, and to have been in your household, to know you as a child and him it too. It marked me and Faiswali, my husband at the time, and connecting with you and him at later was like remembering hearing from a child. That it's always so weird when an adult comes back and be like, "I remember you as a child. Do you remember me?" And you think that they're not. So I was fully okay with you and him at not remembering me. But then you did. You were like, "Oh yeah, this cool African came and lived in my basement and cooked for us." And anyway,
It was
to me,
awesome.
it represents the web of connection that we get to still keep even as we move through the distortion.
Yeah, left an impression on me, that's for sure, and definitely expanded my worldview. There's no doubt about it. I mean, just like to know an African man as like my housemate was very new experience and was so healthy just to like, yeah, just to have that connection with somebody from a very different world and to see you who'd been, talk about going outside of the box, like going to places that I'd never been, and admired your adventurousness and your like spirit. You could feel it, and it was definitely like I was really, it really, I don't know, you know, when like, I don't know, you meet certain people or like you hear a certain song and it sort of tickles something in you that is really powerful. I don't know, it's really exciting and new. And, you know, that's how that when I think back about that time and meeting you, that's how I feel about it. It's like it was, you know, it's a part of many little experiences throughout my life and people that kind of told me things that or demonstrated things that I didn't really know what I was seeing or experiencing until later and could appreciate later. So, yeah, it definitely left an impression.
Yeah, and totally. Even at the time, I remember just kind of feeling proud around it because, like, my husband wasn't a Sikh. He didn't wear a turban. I wore my own unique, colorful turban. I didn't wear white. So I was definitely like finding my way, loving the yoga, but not liking lots of things. And so as a kid, seeing any of it, it always helps to be exposed to be like, oh, there's another way to do this. Um, and then there was just all sorts of impressions around the niceness of the environment. That community was much more well off than anything I had ever experienced, and yet it wasn't wealth. You know what I mean? Like as you're saying, it's just middle America, so to speak. Your parents weren't well off, but they just lived in this. And this is Face Wally's first version of America, so he saw it through this like rich lens. After I had years of telling him, we have no money, we have no money, but it was because of the Bhagwan Singh and Carr that sponsored him to even come in. So it was because of time in Virginia that even opened up the doors to get him into the country, which goes back to the duplicity. Like I got so much of the community and connections while trying to pull apart the things I didn't like, which is what
Yeah,
this work is, you know.
yeah.
Tell us about your song.
You know, I I spent a few minutes thinking about this, and I was just like, "There's nothing that can encapsulate. There's just no. There's nothing that I no track I could play that could uh, express the breadth and depth of feelings and complexity that I feel about all of this. So the song that I chose is very simple, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's by Gang Starr, who was interestingly the rapper that or the duo that created Gang Starr was DJ Premier and the rapper Guru, and I always felt like he's a good guru in my life.
My favorite rap group, by the way, Gang Starr. I learned about them when I was 13, and it was because I was going to public school, and I would be like, "My name's Guru Nishan," and they'd be like, "You mean Guru like Gang Starr?" And so it ended up becoming a way in. You know, you were cool because I didn't even know who Gang Starr was, but of course he has to become my favorite rapper. So thank you for this. Here we go. We are listening to Robin Hood Theory by Gang Starr.
We got to give back for the youth is the future.
Real, that's keeping it wrong.
Now that we're getting somewhere, you know we got to give back for the youth is the future. No doubt that's right and exact. Squeeze the juice out of all the suckers with power and pour some back out so as to water the flowers. This world is ours. That's why the demons are leery. It's our inheritance. This is my Robin Hood theory. Robin Hood theory. I seek son, deceive none. For each one must teach one. At least one must flow and show the structure of freedom. It's me done, cause petty things we don't need them. Let's focus to create something great for all that sees them. They innocent. They know not what they face.
All right, folks. And for copyright reasons, we don't play the whole song, and yet you can click the link in the show notes and you can listen to the entire song on the Uncomfortable Conversations playlist on Spotify. So click in the show notes. Thank you, Shebed, for bringing your voice here. Really appreciate it.
Likewise, thank you.
And this concludes another episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. If you'd like to contribute to this broadcast, you can make a one-time or monthly donation at gurunishan.com or check the show notes for a link. Please email me if you want to be a guest on the podcast at gn@gurunishan.com. And please also subscribe, follow, and support my work. And share this podcast with a friend. A lot of people don't even know it exists yet. And you can share the link and let somebody know it does. Thank you for your listening support. And we'll talk to you on the next one.